The city had been holding its breath for 3 months. Chicago knew what it meant now when the sky did something wrong. After Omni-Man. After the footage every network had replayed until the images burned into collective memory. A man in a red cape turning a subway car into a weapon, turning bodies into wreckage. The city had developed a reflex. Heads tilted up at odd sounds. Traffic stalled when the radio went quiet too long. People kept go-bags near their front doors, the way their grandparents once kept emergency kits for tornadoes. Cecil Stedman had not slept more than 4 hours on any given night since the incident. That part wasn't unusual. What had changed was the quality of his wakefulness. He was no longer managing. He was bracing. The anomaly registered at 11:42 a.m. on a Tuesday. It did not appear on radar, thermal, or any electromagnetic band the GDA had running. What it appeared on was a gravitational distortion sensor, one of 6 prototypes Cecil had quietly funded through a defense contractor's shell 2 years prior, before anyone thought they'd need to monitor for localized space-time irregularities above an American city. The readout showed a single data point, a pressure differential 400 meters above Lakeshore Drive, with no meteorological explanation. Then the sky cracked. No explosion, no shockwave, no sound that registered on audio equipment. What the cameras captured, and the GDA had cameras everywhere now, was a line. A vertical seam in the air above the city, maybe 30 meters long, edges flickering in a way that analysts would argue about for 40 minutes without reaching consensus. Some said heat distortion, others said the air had been folded from the other side by something that knew exactly what it was doing. The seam widened. Cecil was watching the feed from 3 screens when his comm opened. He did not look away. "Get me, Invincible." And Mark Grayson had been in the middle of a physics exam when the alert hit. He recognized the vibration pattern without looking. The custom GDA emergency code Cecil had set up 6 weeks ago handed over, with the tone of someone giving a leash to someone they didn't fully trust yet. He said something to his professor he wouldn't remember afterward and was airborne before the minute was out. He came in fast from the south and saw it immediately. The seam had widened to 50 meters. The edges were no longer flickering, but pulsing slow, rhythmic, like a lung. The air around it was wrong in a way that made his eyes want to slide off the image. He'd seen alien technology. He'd seen things arrive from places that had no name in any human language. But this felt different in a quality he couldn't name. It wasn't that the seam looked dangerous. It looked deliberate. Something came through. Mark's first read humanoid. Slight build, no armor, no visible technology, no propulsion system. Just a figure stepping out of the fold in the air as though stepping through a doorway, and then holding there 400 meters above Lakeshore Drive. With the particular stillness of someone who had recently been moving very fast and had chosen precisely to stop. Silver hair long and loose, catching what little wind existed at that altitude. A face that read young, genuinely, almost disarmingly young, but with a quality behind the eyes that made age feel like the wrong unit of measurement entirely. The build was slight androgynous, nothing like the muscle density Mark associated with threats at this altitude. Simple clothing, no insignia, no weapon, no tech visible on the body at any angle. The figure looked down at the city below with the calm of someone conducting a quiet accounting. Mark closed the distance, running his own accounting in the time it took him to cover 300 meters. No cape, no suit, no tech I can place. Not Viltrumite, wrong build, wrong posture. Not any alien in Cecil's database I've actually seen. Hovering with no visible effort, no propulsion signature. Nothing. He hated that he couldn't classify it. 3 months ago, not knowing what something was had meant Omni-Man. His gut hadn't learned to separate those two things yet. He was 50 meters out when the second thing came through. Not humanoid. A ship, compact angular Viltrumite in its geometry, the way all Viltrumite military hardware, shared a family resemblance built around sharp angles and total disregard for elegance. But something had happened to it. The vessel was tumbling, not flying, rolling along an axis that suggested it had been caught in whatever opened the seam and dragged through sideways. It was burning in two places. Its power systems were gone. It was going to fall, straight down, toward approximately 40,000 people on and around Lakeshore Drive. Mark changed trajectory. He was already calculating intercept when he registered that the silver-haired stranger had moved first. Not fast in the way Viltrumites were, fast not the brutal straight-line acceleration that converted a body into a projectile. The movement was quieter than that. A displacement. The stranger was no longer where they had been, and was instead positioned beneath the falling ship, one hand raised, and then the ship stopped. Not slowed. Stopped. Several hundred tons of Viltrumite military hardware in freefall arrested in midair, as though gravity had been informed its services were temporarily suspended. 2 seconds. Then a redirect. The ship arced away from the packed shoreline, trailing smoke, and hit the lake far enough out that the impact only rocked boats at their moorings. The seam behind it closed without sound, without residual distortion. Just gone. Mark pulled up 5 meters away from the silver-haired stranger and tried to decide what to do with his hands. That's not how any of this works. The vessel's hull, half submerged in Lake Michigan, split open along a fracture line. 3 more figures emerged. Viltrumite scouts. Mark recognized the build, the particular density of muscle, the way they moved through air, with the unconscious ease of people for whom gravity was a minor inconvenience. Young by Viltrumite standards, which meant somewhere between 200 and 400 years old, which meant they had been killing things since before the United States existed. They assessed the situation in under a second. 2 targets in the air. 1 known, 1 unknown. Ship destroyed. Mission compromised. None of them asked questions. The first scout came at Mark, recognizing him from whatever intelligence Viltrum kept on Earth's active defenders. The second and third angled toward the silver-haired stranger, which was either a sound tactical decision or the last strategic error they would make for some time. It was the latter. The scout hit Mark with enough force to push him back 30 meters, and he felt it a dull, full-body concussion that his Viltrumite genetics absorbed but couldn't erase. He caught himself reversed, came back in hard. They met above Michigan Avenue in a collision that cracked windows and buildings on both sides of the street. Mark, through a combination that the scout partially blocked, took 2 hits that would have shattered concrete and kept the pressure on. Across the gap, the second scout closed to striking range of the silver-haired stranger and threw a punch that should have ended the engagement immediately. It didn't land. The stranger had moved again with that quality of displacement, rather than speed, slipping the angle the way water avoids a closed fist, and the scout's arm continued through empty air and kept going past the point arms were designed to reach. There was a sound. The scout's forward momentum carried it through the space where the stranger had been, and by the time it registered, the contact was gone. The stranger was behind it, and the scout was falling, not dead, but with its spine in a configuration that would require serious time to correct. The third scout pulled up short. It watched the silver-haired stranger with an expression Mark had never seen on a Viltrumite face before. Not anger, not recalculation. Something closer to the moment a predator realizes the thing it charged has been watching it the whole time. The stranger looked at the scout. Just looked. No threat display, no shift in stance. The scout attacked anyway. Viltrumites didn't have a strong tradition of backing down from unclassified threats. Faster this time, more deliberate feinting before committing. The stranger tracked it with a patience that suggested the real strike had been read several beats before the body acted on it, and then with a precision that was almost unkind in its economy, took the scout apart. Not killed. Rendered non-functional limbs locked momentum, arrested nervous system, interrupted at a depth that left the scout conscious, but incapable of coordinated movement. The whole engagement had taken less than 40 seconds. Mark broke away from his own scout, still functional, increasingly frustrated, and put it through the upper floor of a parking structure. The structure held. The scout didn't immediately get up. He turned back. The silver-haired stranger was holding the third scout by the collar of its uniform, suspended in open air, examining it. The attention was absolute, not curious in any ordinary sense, but deep in the way that suggested layers of assessment running beneath the surface, something more systematic than a single pair of eyes could account for. The scout's breathing had changed. Some part of it, the part wired for survival across 4 centuries of warfare, was responding to something it couldn't identify in the stranger's amber gaze. Below them, 40,000 people had no idea how close the last 4 minutes had come to ending differently. Car alarms were going off. Someone had already started filming. Cecil's voice came through Mark's calm, quiet, and precise. "Don't engage the unknown. Maintain distance. We're monitoring." Mark kept distance. He watched the stranger, and the scout watched what looked like a silent, internal consultation, an expression that shifted through several positions without the face quite moving. And then the stranger looked up and met his eyes across the open air. The scout hung between them, breathing, damaged but alive. "Who are you?" Mark said. Something in the stranger's expression settled, not a smile, not warmth, but the quality of a conclusion being reached. "Start with who sent them." The voice was quiet, level. It carried the weight of someone who had stopped needing volume a long time ago. Mark had no answer. He stayed where he was, suspended above a city still learning to live with its own fragility, watching the silver-haired stranger hold a Viltrumite soldier in one hand, like an open question neither of them had the full context to answer yet. 300 kilometers overhead, a compact relay station continued to pulse Chicago's coordinates into the dark between stars. It had been transmitting since before the seam opened. It would keep transmitting until something made it stop. Below, Cecil Stedman rewound the footage of the falling ship and watched the moment it stopped. Watched it again. Then twice more. His expression didn't change. He reached for his phone. He had a great many calls to make, and none of them were going to be easy. Cecil Stedman arrived at the perimeter in 11 minutes, which was fast for a man who traveled by car and whose city had just reclassified its threat level for the 3rd time in a quarter. The GDA cordon was already up, black vehicles, plainclothes agents running equipment out of unmarked vans. The kind of organized response that looked to civilian eyes like a film shoot or a gas leak investigation. Cecil had spent 20 years building the infrastructure for exactly this kind of quiet. He was proud of it the way surgeons are proud of clean incisions. He stood at the edge of the mobile command unit and looked at the feed from the aerial drone they'd managed to position 300 meters out. The image was steady. The 2 figures were still airborne. The prisoner and Cecil had already categorized it as a prisoner, not a captive, because the distinction mattered in how you planned the next 48 hours, hung in open air below the silver-haired one's grip, breathing in the shallow rhythm of something that had learned to conserve. His senior analyst leaned in. No biological match in any database. Human presenting, but the energy profile when it stopped that ship. I saw the footage. The readings don't correspond to any known. I know what they don't correspond to. Cecil kept his eyes on the drone feed. Get me a channel. Direct, unrecorded on their end. The analyst hesitated. "Sir, if we open a channel, they'll know we're..." "They already know." He finally looked away from the screen. Open the channel. The comm request came through on a frequency Mark didn't recognize, routed through a GDA relay, and delivered via the earpiece he'd started wearing on active calls 3 months ago, after Cecil had pointed out correctly, irritatingly, that shouting at each other across open air was not a secure communication method. He watched the silver-haired stranger tilt their head by approximately 3 degrees. They had heard the channel open. Mark didn't know how. There had been no sound, no visible device, no indication of any communication equipment at all. But the tilt was unmistakable. The micro-adjustment of someone whose attention had just been redirected by something internal. And then in the space between one breath and the next, something behind those amber eyes shifted. Not expression, not focus. Something deeper, like a process reclassifying its primary subject. Then the stranger spoke, and the voice came through the channel as cleanly as if they had been standing in the same room as Cecil's equipment. "You've been watching since before the seam opened." It wasn't a question. Cecil's response came back measured and smooth. "We watch everything. It's our job." A beat. "You're picking up our frequency without a receiver. That's interesting. You have a lot of interesting equipment for a planet that's supposed to be pre-contact. We've had some accelerated educational experiences recently." Cecil's tone didn't shift. "I'd like to understand what you want." "Right now," the stranger said, "I want to know who owns the ship." Cecil let it sit, not hesitation, Mark knew, but the particular weight of something being calculated before committing. The difference was imperceptible to most people. "We're working on that. It matches Viltrumite design signatures. We have some familiarity with Viltrumite hardware." "More than familiarity?" "More than familiarity," Cecil confirmed. "You're not Viltrumite." "No. You're not from this planet." "Also no. You're not here as part of whatever sent that ship." The stranger looked down at the Viltrumite soldier hanging from their grip. The soldier had gone very still. Not the stillness of unconsciousness, but of something that had assessed its options and found them insufficient. "If I were," the stranger said, "this conversation would already be over." Mark watched Cecil's side of the feed through his earpiece. The absence of sound that meant Cecil was running implications forward before he committed to a position. Mark had learned to read that silence over 6 weeks of increasingly uncomfortable working arrangements. "Fair point," Cecil said. "Then what are you passing through?" A beat. "With a problem I didn't plan for." "The ship." "The ship," the stranger agreed, "and everything behind it." On the ground, Cecil turned from the drone feed and moved to the secondary analysis station, where 2 of his technical specialists were running comparative overlays, the energy profile from the seam event against every archived anomaly in GDA records going back to the agency's founding. Nothing matched. The closest analog was a theoretical model one of their contracted physicists had published about localized dimensional membrane stress, which had been filed under speculative and forgotten until 40 minutes ago. He pulled up the direct visual on the prisoner. The Viltrumite scout was conscious. Its vital signs, estimated from the drone's thermal imaging, were stable. It was not attempting to escape, which Cecil read as a calculation, not a surrender. A 400-year-old soldier didn't stop fighting because it was tired. It stopped when it had finished running the numbers and didn't like the result. What Cecil was watching more carefully was the silver-haired unknown holding it. The body language was completely still. No adjustment of grip, no visible muscular effort. The face was directed at the prisoner with an attention that Cecil found, after sustained observation, distinctly unsettling, not because it was aggressive, but because it had the quality of a process rather than a gaze. Systematic. Patient. Drilling into layers that vision alone shouldn't have been able to reach. The scout's breathing rate had increased, which the drone's thermal imaging captured and flagged. Some part of it, the part wired for survival across centuries of warfare, was responding to something it couldn't identify in that regard. He keyed the channel. What are you getting from it? Confirmation that the ship wasn't lost. It was tracking something. Tracking what? The seam I came through. The signal it left. The stranger's gaze stayed on the scout, but something shifted a fractional interior withdrawal, as though a secondary process had just completed and filed its result. When the voice continued, it carried the clean precision of a conclusion rather than an inference. The scout carries response protocols, preloaded, which means someone knew there was a possibility of an anomalous entry event in this sector. Cecil was quiet. That's a problem? Yes. How long ago were those protocols loaded? Recent. Within the last 48 hours. Mark cut in before he could stop himself. They were already watching for something coming through. They were watching for a something, the stranger said. Not this specifically. The protocols are general category investigate and report. But they were already surveilling this region of space. The stranger's gaze came back to the scout, and the scout's breathing changed again. That's not standard survey behavior. Cecil said very carefully, no, it isn't. He moved back to the main feed. Above the city, the silver-haired unknown released the scout. Not dropped it, released it with a precision that left the Viltrumite hovering under its own power, damaged and functional, and clearly not interested in further engagement. It drifted back. The stranger watched it retreat with the same systematic regard applied to everything else. I'm going to need this scout, Cecil said. You'll have it? The stranger's eyes moved from the retreating soldier to the drone Cecil was watching from a direct look across 300 meters that landed with more weight than the distance should have allowed. But I'm keeping a copy of what it carries. Mark said, a copy. Of the data. No elaboration. Cecil looked at his analyst, who looked back with an expression that said, I have no category for this, and said nothing. All right, Cecil said. We can work with that. He paused. For now, are you planning to stay in the area? That depends on what the scout signal connects to. And if it connects to something we can't handle. The stranger looked at the city below the cars, the crowds at the cordon. Lined the phones recording everything, the ordinary Wednesday afternoon machinery of a major city continuing to function because it didn't know what else to do. Then it stops being your problem to handle alone. The channel stayed open. Nobody spoke. Cecil made a small gesture to his analyst. The gesture meant increase the passive monitoring array, keep it invisible, and do not let that thing know what we're doing. He did not believe for a moment that the thing didn't already know. The scout had retreated to the far edge of viable range and was holding position, watching Mark thought the way an animal watches from a distance, when it hasn't decided yet whether to keep running. Mark drifted closer to the silver-haired stranger. Not enough to suggest a threshold was being crossed. Enough to speak without the comm relay. You said you were passing through. I was. And now? The stranger's attention shifted to him different from the way it had moved across Cecil. Not warmer, but more direct, as though Cecil had been assessed as infrastructure and Mark was being assessed as something that made decisions. The two required different kinds of processing. Now I have a reason to stay a little longer. The ship, the stranger said, and the fact that someone knew to be looking for it. Below, the Viltrumite scout made a decision and began moving upward and outward on a trajectory that would carry it beyond the atmosphere within minutes. Cecil's people tracked it. They didn't attempt to intercept because Cecil had not given that order and because everyone in the mobile command unit had watched what happened to 2 other Viltrumite scouts in the last hour and had arrived at the same arithmetic. Mark watched it go. You're letting it leave. It has nowhere useful to go. Its ship is gone. Its communication array is gone. A beat the interior kind, brief enough that only Mark caught it this time because he'd been watching for it. And what it's carrying is already compromised. You got everything you needed. The stranger didn't answer that. They looked out at the space the scout had vacated, at the thin line of sky where the seam had been, at the city spread below, in all its complicated, fragile Wednesday afternoon normality. There's a relay, they said, outside your planet's detection range. It's been active since before I arrived. The scout signal was feeding data back to it. The stranger turned to face Mark, and the directness of it felt like a door closing on certain options. Whatever sent that ship isn't operating blind. They have positioning data on this system. Mark said, Cecil. I heard, Cecil said through the comm. Level, controlled. We're working on confirmation. You won't find it on any array you're currently running. The calm in the statement came not from composure, but from something more uncomfortable certainty that had already done the math. The frequency sits outside your monitoring bands. I can give you the parameters. Cecil let the silence run for 2 full seconds. Why would you do that? Because a relay transmitting my entry coordinates into deep space is my problem as much as yours. The stranger glanced at a specific point in the sky, not upward in the general sense, but at an angle that referenced something precise in a direction geography couldn't map. Probably more. Send the parameters. The data arrived in the GDA system 0.3 seconds later. Not through any channel Cecil's team had open. Not through encryption they could trace backward. The file simply existed in their system, clean complete, no handshake protocol, no origin address, no authentication trail. As if the concept of network security had been informed it was not relevant to this particular transfer and had stepped aside. One of the analysts stood up from her station. Sir. Her voice had gone flat in the way that meant she was controlling something. I need you to look at this. Cecil crossed to her station and looked. She pointed at the transfer log, or rather at the absence of a transfer log. The file was there. The record of how it arrived was not. Our firewall didn't flag it, she said. I know. Our firewall should have flagged it. Even a clean file should generate an entry record. There's nothing. It's like the file was already there. Cecil straightened. His expression hadn't changed. The expression never changed. But something behind it had gone very, very careful. Recalibrate the arrays with those parameters. Full passive sweep. Do not transmit anything outbound until I authorize it. She sat back down and started working. 2 other analysts had drifted over to look at the blank transfer log, and the silence around those 3 stations had taken on a particular texture. The specific quiet of people who understood that something had just happened to their systems, that their systems had no language to describe. Above the city, the GDA's newly calibrated arrays began painting a shape in high orbit, compact, dark, transmitting on a band that nothing on Earth had been designed to detect. It had been there for longer than any of them wanted to calculate. Mark was still in the air when the confirmation came through his earpiece. He looked across at the stranger, at the silver-haired youth hovering in the afternoon light. Amber eyes already tracking the bearing the relay occupied, as though it had known exactly where to look before anyone told them. He pulled closer, close enough that the next question felt like one person asking another, not a field operative querying an unknown variable. "Okay," he said. "I think we're past pretending this is normal." He paused. "You got a name?" The stranger looked at him. Something in the amber gaze shifted, not surprise, not warmth, but the specific quality of someone deciding that the exchange was worth making. "Remuru Tempest." Mark repeated it once under his breath, filing it into place. "Rimuru," he said. "That's better than unknown entity." Cecil reached for his phone. "Get me Nolan Grayson," he said quietly. "Tell him it's not about his son." He had been on a station orbiting Taliskria when the GDA signal reached him. Not through any channel he'd given them, because he hadn't given them any channels, but routed through a relay intercept that someone on Earth had been clever enough to configure. The message was 4 words from Cecil Stedman. "Not about your son," which meant it was about something worse. Nolan had been gone from Earth for 3 months. In that time, he had not spoken to Mark, had not filed a flight plan with anyone, and had spent most of his hours doing the kind of work that didn't have a clean description existing in the space between what he had been and what he was becoming, which was not a comfortable space, but was the only one currently available. He had fought twice, both times, against threats to coalition-aligned settlements. Both times he had won. Neither time had it felt like anything in particular. He re-entered Earth's atmosphere over the Pacific at a speed that registered on the GDA's new sensor arrays as a heat signature roughly consistent with a small meteorite, which was intentional. Cecil would know regardless. But there was a difference between knowing and having it handed to you on a platter. And Nolan had spent too many centuries in Empire service to unlearn the habit of keeping his approach information to himself. He found them above the lake. 3 of them, Mark in the yellow and blue suit, the GDA drone hovering at diplomatic distance, and a 4th figure Nolan had not expected. He came in high and slow, which was the Viltrumite equivalent of raising open hands, and took the measure of what he was looking at from 200 meters out before closing the gap. Silver hair, young face that wasn't, hovering with the relaxed quality of someone for whom altitude was an irrelevant variable. No suit, no technology. Nolan could identify no weapon in any configuration he recognized. He had seen a great many things in 400 years of service combat and travel across systems that most humans didn't know existed. He had developed over those centuries a reliable instinct for what category a threat belonged to before he had to engage it. That instinct had kept him alive in situations where being wrong would have been permanent. It was not filing this one cleanly. "Dad." Mark's voice carried the specific neutrality of someone who had decided not to make the reunion into a scene. Nolan recognized the decision and respected it. "Mark." He stopped 10 meters from the silver-haired figure and looked at it directly. "This is what Cecil wanted me to see." The figure looked back. No deference, no hostility, the kind of regard that suggested Nolan was being measured against criteria that had nothing to do with reputation or history. Nolan held it for a moment, reading back. Something behind that gaze was running faster than any individual should have been able to run. He filed that and moved on. "You came fast," Rimuru said. Cecil's message implied urgency. Nolan kept his eyes on the youth across from him, cataloging what he could. He was right. They moved off the lake. Nolan's suggestion, because holding a conversation 400 meters above a city full of cameras was tactically poor regardless of how many times the GDA claimed to have the feed secured. Rimuru followed without comment. Mark followed. Below them, Cecil's mobile unit repositioned to maintain line of sight, which Nolan had expected. They came down on the roof of a building that had been vacated by GDA personnel 6 minutes prior, which meant Cecil had been anticipating this conversation since before Nolan arrived. Nolan noted that and filed it alongside everything else Cecil had done in the past hour that Nolan would not have done but understood completely. Rimuru stood at the roof's edge and looked out at the city, not contemplatively, but with the focused quality of something still running its accounting. Nolan said, "Tell me what happened." Rimuru gave him the account in 8 sentences. No texture, no interpretation. Entry coordinates. Viltrumite scout vessel 3 combatants live capture data extraction relay identified. When it finished, it waited. Nolan was quiet for a moment, not processing the facts. He'd absorbed those in real time, but running the implications through a framework that 4 centuries of Imperial service had built into his bones. The framework was still there. It had always been there. He was no longer proud of how well it worked. "The protocol load," he said. 48 hours? Yes. That's not a standing order. Viltrum doesn't preload response protocols for anomalous entry events unless they have reason to expect one. He turned from the city view to look at Rimuru directly. They were watching this region before you came through. That's my rid. I wanted yours. The distinction landed, not asking for confirmation of something already settled, asking for a second measure from someone who had worked inside the machine. Nolan accepted that and continued. Which means they already knew something was coming. Not you specifically, but a disturbance in this sector. His jaw tightened slightly. The relay. What frequency band Sim? Rimuru named a range. Nolan's expression didn't change, but something behind it recalibrated. Tier 2 surveillance array, he said. Not standard survey, not exploration. Tier 2 is military intelligence infrastructure. He shifted his weight barely a fraction, and Mark, watching from 2 meters back, recognized the movement. It was the thing his father did when information was landing exactly where he'd hoped it wouldn't. They're not just watching Earth. They're running active threat assessment on this system. Mark said, "How long?" "Could be weeks. Could be longer." Nolan glanced at his son, brief, carrying more weight than its duration suggested. After Omni-Man left, Thrag would have flagged Earth for reassessment. Too much exposure. Too many unknowns. He returned his gaze to Rimuru. Sending scouts to investigate an anomalous entry is textbook. Losing 3 scouts to a single unknown entity in under a minute is not. How will they read it? Short. No inflection, suggesting the answer would be a surprise, just a request for independent confirmation of a model already partially built. As a threat requiring measured response, Nolan said. Not full engagement, not yet. Thrag is methodical. He'll want to understand the ceiling before he commits resources. He paused. He'll send something with more experience. Something designed to draw out a full response rather than just investigate. And if the relay stops transmitting, Nolan looked at Rimuru for a moment. Then he knows the threat has offensive reach and isn't waiting to be found. The calculation behind his eyes sharpened to something cold. It compresses his timeline. He stops treating it as an anomaly and starts treating it as a variable that needs to be resolved. Good. Nolan and Mark both looked at it. I'd rather be a problem they're actively trying to solve than one they're still deciding whether to take seriously. Rimuru's gaze had shifted to a specific bearing in the sky, not upward in the general sense, but at an angle that referenced something precise. Ciel. Quiet. Between address and instruction. A beat. The kind that carried weight in it, not silence exactly, but the specific stillness of a decision being executed somewhere out of reach. "Target fixed," Rimuru said to no one visible. "Remove it." Nothing happened that anyone on the rooftop could see. No light, no sound, no indication that anything in the physical world had changed. The city continued below. The drone held position. Nolan watched Rimuru's face. For a few seconds, the awareness behind it had clearly gone somewhere else entirely. Somewhere that had nothing to do with the rooftop or the people standing on it. Then, it returned clean and complete. "The relay is gone, it said. Nolan absorbed that. Mark absorbed it somewhat more visibly. "You just reached into a Tier 2 Viltrumite military surveillance array," Nolan said, "from a rooftop in Chicago." "Yes." "Without moving." "Yes." A long beat. Nolan looked at the sky at the coordinates Rimuru had referenced at nothing his eyes could resolve. Then he looked back. "How many relays do they have in this system?" "One fewer than before," Rimuru said. "More once the sweep completes." Mark said, "CL." Rimuru didn't elaborate, turning back to Nolan. "The next asset they send," it said. "Walk me through the options." And Nolan did. He laid it out without editorializing. Because editorializing would have been dishonest, and he was trying these days to be honest about the things he knew. He explained the tier structure of Viltrum's response protocols. The difference between a scout action and a measured escalation. The specific types of assets Thrag deployed when he wanted to test an enemy's ceiling. He explained what a compressed timeline looked like from the Empire's operational side. The logistics, the communication chains, the way Thrag read a sudden loss of intelligence infrastructure. He explained why losing a relay was categorically different from losing 3 scouts, because scouts were expendable and relays represented years of positioning. He heard himself speaking. The vocabulary came easily. Tier 2 response window, asset deployment, escalation threshold, the language of a machine he had operated for 4 centuries. He had not had to think about these things for 3 months. They were still there, immediate and intact, like muscle memory that outlasted the body's willingness to use it. He kept talking. He did not look at Mark while he did. Mark stood slightly apart and listened to his father translate the operational logic of the Empire that had built him. Nolan's voice was steady throughout, factual. The voice of someone for whom this had once been Tuesday. The part that hit hardest wasn't that his father remembered all of it. It was how naturally it came, how the words moved, without effort, without friction, without the small resistances that should have been there if the distance from it was real. He didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't have been smaller than the silence. When Nolan finished, Rimuru said, "The next asset, timeline. If they move fast, and they will once the relay goes dark days, maybe less." Nolan's mustache shifted slightly, the tell of a man running a timeline he didn't like. "They won't send a scout team. They'll send something designed to generate an unambiguous response. To see what I do when I can't stay defensive. To see what you do," Nolan said, "when the cost of restraint goes up." Rimuru took that in. Very still for a moment, the kind of stillness that had nothing to do with physical calm, and everything to do with a final variable being accounted for. "Then we have a window," it said. "And I'd rather use it than wait for them to close it." Nolan looked at Rimuru for a moment longer. Then he said, "I should tell you I spent 400 years helping build what's coming. The relay infrastructure, the survey protocols, the response tiers. I know how it works because I helped design parts of it." He let that sit. I'm telling you that so you know what my read on their timeline is actually worth. Rimuru met his gaze steadily. You confirmed what I expected. That's worth more than a guess. Nolan accepted that. It was he thought the right answer, not a compliment, not a reassurance, just an accurate accounting of what had happened in the last 20 minutes. Rimuru had been running verification, not orientation, which meant it had already built most of the model before he opened his mouth. He revised his assessment upward, then stopped because he suspected Rimuru had already accounted for him doing exactly that. Turnt. In the outer reaches of the system beyond the orbital lanes, Earth actively monitored an automated station registered the termination of relay signal TR7 and flagged the event for immediate review. The review took 11 seconds. The flag reached Grand Regent Thrag 40 seconds after that. He read the report once, set it down. The relay was gone, not disrupted, not degraded, not subject to any of the standard failure modes a Tier 2 array was built to survive. Gone. Signal termination was absolute and instantaneous, which ruled out equipment failure, which meant it had not failed. It had been removed. Something on that planet had reached into his surveillance infrastructure and taken it apart. Thrag was not given to the kind of anger that showed on the surface. What moved through him reading the report a second time was colder than anger, the specific recalibration of a commander who had just learned that the model he was working from was wrong by a margin that required rebuilding from the base. He set the report on the desk, looked at nothing for a moment. Then he reached for the communication array and opened a line to an asset he had not needed in some time. Not one he sent to investigate. One he sent when he needed to find out exactly how hard something would hit back and whether it would hesitate before doing it. The order was 3 sentences. The kind that didn't need elaboration, because the recipient had been doing this work for longer than most civilizations had existed and had never once needed to be told what the job actually meant. The first indication was not a ship. It was a pressure change, the kind that didn't register on seismic equipment or barometric sensors, but that the GDA's expanded atmospheric array had been reconfigured in the 48 hours since the lake incident to catch. A displacement in the upper stratosphere. Something descending through the thermosphere without propulsion signature, without heat. Bloom, without any of the energy profiles associated with either alien technology or orbital debris. Something that was simply falling in a controlled way at a speed that suggested it had chosen to arrive at a specific place at a specific time and had calculated the descent accordingly. Cecil had the alert on 3 screens before the object cleared 50,000 feet. "Get me visual," he said, "and get Invincible." Mark was already moving when the comm hit. He'd been on the roof of his building. 3 months of elevated threat levels had made him stop sleeping with the window closed, and the bearing that Cecil fed him put the descent vector over central metropolis. He pushed hard and came in from the east, dropping altitude as the city spread out below him. He saw it from 4 kilometers out. The figure descending through the lower clouds was large. That was the first thing that registered large in the specific way of Viltrumites. The kind of mass that came not just from height, but from density, from centuries of physical conditioning that had reshaped the body into something closer to a weapon than a person. The build was broad, heavy-shouldered, moving through the air with the unhurried confidence of something that had been the most dangerous entity in every room it had ever entered and had stopped being impressed by that fact a long time ago. Old. That was the second thing. Not old in any way that looked like weakness, old in the way glaciers were old, in the way anything that had survived long enough accumulated a density that had nothing to do with muscle. One arm bore a gauntlet that was clearly not Viltrumite standard issue heavy tech. dark alloy covering the forearm and fist in layered plates that hummed with something electromagnetic at close range. Conquest came down in the middle of a city block at noon. The impact displaced the street surface outward in a ring concrete and asphalt folded up from the center like a slow wave, vehicles overturning glass, shattering in the buildings on both sides. The dust cloud from the crater was still rising. When he stood up from the crouch, looked at the city around him, and spoke. "I was told," Conquest said loud enough to carry across the block, "that something interesting had arrived." His voice was the voice of someone who used volume as a tool rather than a reaction, controlled projected designed to reach the people he was addressing, and also everyone within 200 meters who might have been considering whether or not to run. The answer the voice implied was that running was irrelevant. "I was hoping." He continued, sweeping his gaze across the buildings, the stopped traffic, the civilians who had not yet fully processed what had just happened to their street. It would still be here. Mark came in fast and hit him. The collision was significant. It moved Conquest approximately 4 meters and put a crack in the building behind him, and for a fraction of a second, Mark felt the impact feedback he expected from hitting something very large and very dense. Then Conquest's hand closed around his arm, and the momentum reversed, and Mark found himself being redirected, not thrown, redirected with the casual efficiency of someone correcting a minor inconvenience into the face of the building across the street. He came back out through the wall. "The young one," Conquest said, sounding mildly interested. "You were in the files." Mark shook the debris off his shoulders. The building behind him had a mark-shaped hole in it at the second floor. He'd hit a support column. The column had lost the argument. The building was still standing, but its opinion on the matter was mixed. "Yeah," Mark said, "I get that a lot." He went back in. What followed was not a fight in any equal sense of the term. Conquest was older, heavier, and operated with the kind of technical precision that came from having done this for so many centuries that the techniques had become instinct. He took Mark's hits the way mountains take weather, absorbing, redirecting, occasionally indifferent. When he hit back, he hit with purpose, a forearm to the chest that put Mark through a parked delivery van, a grip on the shoulder that applied precisely enough pressure to make the joint sing with warning, a casual sweep that took Mark's footing and left him briefly occupying the inside of a newsstand. The tech gauntlet hit differently. Mark caught one strike from it across the ribs and felt the electromagnetic component discharge on contact. Not enough to disable him, but enough to scramble his nervous system for 2 seconds, which was enough for Conquest to hit him twice more. By the time Mark pulled himself out of the crater, Conquest had put him in shallow, maybe a meter deep. Formerly the intersection of 2 lanes of traffic, there were casualties. Not from Conquest targeting civilians deliberately. From the collateral of a Viltrumite moving at combat speed through an urban environment, and not particularly concerning himself with what got in the way. A bus had been overturned. 3 cars had been crushed by debris. People were bleeding, and people were running, and Cecil's voice was in Mark's ears saying things that Mark was only partially hearing. Rimuru had not moved. That was the thing Mark registered when he got upright and looked back across the block. Rimuru was standing, not hovering. Standing on the surface of the overturned concrete, weight distributed with the ease of someone on level ground at the edge of the cleared zone. Watching. The amber eyes tracked Conquest's movement, with a quality Mark had started to recognize the depth of something processing far more information than the eyes alone could gather. Conquest had noticed. He turned from Mark, not dismissing him, filing him as a lower priority target, and looked at Rimuru across 50 meters of destroyed street. "There it is," he said. Rimuru looked back at him. No posture shift, no widening of stance. The simple clothing, the silver hair catching the noon light, the slight build that looked from any reasonable angle like a young person who had wandered into the wrong part of the city at the wrong time. "You came from the relay network," Rimuru said. It was not a question, and it was not a greeting. It was a classification delivered with the same tone a technician might use when identifying a component. Conquest's expression shifted not to anger, but to an amusement that had nothing generous in it, the kind that came from expecting deference and receiving instead something that didn't know it was supposed to be deferential. "You have a mouth," Conquest said, covering the 50 meters in less than a second. What happened next, Mark would spend a significant amount of time afterward trying to describe accurately and failing. Conquest's leading strike was a full-force blow from the gauntlet arm, the kind of hit that, based on Mark's recent experience, was capable of embedding things in buildings. It was on target. It was fast. By any reasonable application of physics, it should have connected. The air between Conquest's fist and Rimuru's position bent, not dramatically, not visibly at normal perception. But something in the geometry of the space between attacker and target went briefly wrong. The kind of wrongness that registered in the peripheral vision as a shimmer. A lensing, as if the air itself had briefly become a surface with different refractive properties. The strike arrived where Rimuru had been. Rimuru was 2 meters to the left, with no visible transit between positions. Conquest drove through the space, recovered, turned. His expression had shifted again away from amusement toward something more calibrating. "Interesting," he said. He attacked again and again, each time with the technical precision of a warrior who had spent centuries developing combinations that left no viable evasion angle, who had learned how living things moved and how to close every gap. Each time the geometry disagreed with him. It was not teleportation. Mark was watching carefully enough to be certain of that. Rimuru was moving, the motion was real. There was transit, but the transit was happening inside some quality of the space that didn't quite correspond to normal physical movement. Like watching someone walk a path that curved slightly differently than the eye expected. And Rimuru was doing nothing else. No counterattack, no visible effort. Just the continuous reorientation, the amber eyes tracking Conquest, with an attention that seemed to be recording everything. And the particular stillness of someone who was not yet done observing. "Cecil," Mark said into his comm, "you're seeing this." "I'm seeing it," Cecil said. His voice was stripped of everything except the fact of the observation. "My sensors can't classify the energy signature. It's not registering as technology, not as any known meta-human ability, not as anything in the database." A beat, very short, the kind Cecil allowed himself only when what he was about to say didn't fit any of his existing categories. "It's behaving like physics is optional." Mark watched Conquest's gauntlet discharge on empty air for the 3rd time. "Yeah," he said. "I noticed." On a different frequency, Nolan had been circling at altitude watching. He had seen a great many things fight. He had fought a great many things. He had studied combat as both a practitioner and a strategist across systems and species, and 4 centuries of accumulated experience, and he had developed a very clear taxonomy of how things moved when they were engaged in violence. Conquest moved correctly. Every adjustment, every combination, every recovery correct. This was a Viltrumite who had been fighting for longer than most of humanity's recorded history, and every movement reflected that. The gauntlet added a variable, but a manageable one. Rimuru moved wrong, not incorrectly wrong in the sense of outside the taxonomy. The evasions weren't predictions of Conquest's strikes. Or not only predictions, they were happening in a spatial register that didn't correspond to the normal relationship between attack and defense. As if the question "where will the strike land" was being answered by changing what the word "where" meant. Nolan had fought beings who could manipulate gravity, beings with spatial abilities, beings with precognitive combat enhancement. This was not any of those things. Or it was all of them simultaneously, or something that those things were pale approximations of. What he was watching was a combat system that Viltrum had no doctrine for. The Empire's entire military philosophy was built on the assumption that strength, speed, and endurance were the variables that mattered. Every training program, every tactical framework, every engagement history had been developed around that assumption. The assumption had never failed because Viltrumites were always the top of the physical hierarchy, and the physical hierarchy was the only hierarchy that mattered. Rimuru was not participating in the physical hierarchy. Rimuru was operating in a different one entirely. Nolan descended slowly, maintaining observation distance. He did not intervene. Intervention was not what this moment required. Below, the geometry disagreed with Conquest for the 7th time. He stopped. This was notable. Conquest did not stop mid-engagement. Stopping was an acknowledgement that the engagement had parameters outside his control. And Conquest had spent 400 years carefully avoiding anything with parameters outside his control. But he stopped, and he looked at Rimuru across the space between them. And something in his expression moved toward a register that was for Conquest unusual. Evaluation. "What are you?" he said. It came out flat, which was more honest than if it had come out with any affect attached. Rimuru's amber eyes regarded him with that same quality of deep, unhurried processing. "The wrong target," Rimuru said. The air changed. It was subtle enough that Conquest almost missed it, a slight shift in atmospheric pressure, a fractional alteration in the quality of the space between them. Something that the electromagnetic sensors in his gauntlet registered as an anomaly before his eyes caught up. And then the geometry of the space around Conquest changed more significantly. And for approximately 2 seconds, Conquest experienced a disorientation he hadn't felt in centuries. The wrongness of being somewhere that wasn't quite the same as the somewhere he had been an instant before. When the space resolved, Conquest's right arm was behind him, at an angle that required effort. His gauntlet arm was extended outward and downward. His center of mass had been redirected by approximately 30 degrees from where it had been, which meant he was compensating hard to avoid losing his footing. He had not been struck. Nothing had touched him. The space he occupied had simply been rearranged. Mark watched from 15 meters away and said nothing because there was nothing useful to say. A pale geometric pattern faded from the air between Rimuru and Conquest, not glowing exactly, more like the residual impression of a structure that had briefly existed in the space and had now been removed. It was there for less than 3 seconds. The GDA cameras caught it. Cecil's analysts would spend the next 6 hours failing to classify it. Rimuru looked at Conquest steadily. The silver-haired youth had not moved from the position they'd occupied for the last 2 minutes. The simple clothing showed no sign of effort. The amber eyes held no particular heat. "You were sent to measure something," Rimuru said. "You have your measurement. You can report back." Conquest was not the kind of entity that accepted dismissal. He had never in 400 years been dismissed by anything that survived the subsequent 3 minutes. His jaw set. His weight shifted forward, and then it shifted back, because the air had changed again, not dramatically, not with any visible display, but with the quiet certainty of something establishing a boundary that was absolute rather than aggressive. Conquest had been in enough combat to know the difference between a threat and a fact. Threats could be challenged. Facts were simply the current state of reality. He straightened, adjusted the gauntlet, looked at Rimuru for a long moment, the look of a tactician logging data rather than expressing emotion. Then he looked at the city around him. The overturned vehicles, the broken glass, the people at the edges of the cordon who were filming everything on their phones, the bus on its side, the impact craters, his own handiwork spread across 3 blocks. "Next time," Conquest said with the flat certainty of a man making a logistical note rather than a threat, "there will be more of us." He left the way he came, straight up, fast. Mark watched him go until he was a dot and then nothing. The city was very loud around him. Sirens, alarms, the specific acoustic signature of a major urban area, processing the fact that something very bad had just happened in its middle and was now provisionally over. He turned back to Rimuru. The silver-haired youth was looking up at where Conquest had been, not tracking, not concerned, but with the specific quality of someone finishing a calculation and storing the result. "He'll have a full report to whoever sent him within the hour," Rimuru said, without looking at Mark. "I know." Mark looked at the damage around them, 3 blocks of it scored into the city like a lesson. "The people in that bus are alive. I confirmed that before I let him leave." Mark had not seen Rimuru do anything that looked like confirming the status of bus passengers. He had been watching closely. He said nothing about this because he had learned over the past 24 hours that there were categories of things Rimuru did that did not have visible correlates. Nolan came down from altitude and landed 20 meters back, close enough to have heard the exchange. He looked at the geometric residue still fading from the air between the impact craters, at the space where Conquest had briefly experienced a different arrangement of reality at Rimuru, standing in the center of it all, in simple clothing with silver hair catching the afternoon light. His Viltrumite instinct, which had spent 4 centuries correctly classifying every threat it had ever encountered, offered him nothing. No category, no match, no comparable case from the archive. He had known this was coming. He had understood it intellectually since the rooftop in Chicago. Seeing it was different. "We need to talk," he said to Rimuru, "about what comes next." Rimuru turned to look at him. The amber eyes were calm. Whatever calculation had been running had completed. "Yes," Rimuru said. "We do." 3 blocks away, inside a GDA monitoring van that had been repositioned twice during the engagement to maintain optimal coverage. Cecil Stedman rewound the footage of the geometric pattern and watched it appear and disappear. He watched it 4 times. Then he opened a new file and typed a single classification header at the top of the blank document. He stared at it for a moment. Then he deleted it and left the document empty because nothing he typed was going to be accurate, and Cecil Stedman did not put in accurate information in official files. The footage ran on a loop in 3 separate GDA facilities before Cecil ordered it locked behind a 12-person clearance requirement, and by that point, it had already been copied 17 times by people with 12-person clearance requirements. This was... Cecil reflected the fundamental problem with evidence that rewrote the rules. You couldn't keep people from looking at it. You could only control the speed at which the looking spread. He watched it himself for the 14th time in a conference room that had been cleared of everyone except the equipment. The geometric pattern that appeared and faded in the air between Rimuru and Conquest. The way Conquest's mass had been redirected without contact. The moment Conquest stopped, not retreated stopped, which was something Conquest did not do, and the quality of the evaluation that had crossed his face in the seconds before he made the decision to leave. That last part was what Cecil kept returning to. Not the spatial distortion, not the physics disagreement. Those were classification problems, and Cecil had spent his career solving classification problems. What he kept returning to was Conquest's face, because Conquest had stopped. Not because he was beaten a Viltrumite of that age, and experience didn't stop because of damage or exhaustion. The body didn't work that way. but because he had encountered something he didn't have a category for, and he had made the rational decision that engaging further with an unclassified threat was not a productive use of his current resources. A Viltrumite had made a rational retreat. Cecil had read every GDA file on Viltrumite psychology. He had interviewed Nolan Grayson. He had studied the behavioral patterns of every Viltrumite Earth had encountered. Rational retreat was not in the behavioral profile. Viltrumites recalculated. They adjusted. They deployed better assets. They did not retreat because a target confused them. Until now. He reached for the conference room phone and dialed an internal extension. "Get me a status on our guest," he said. "Current condition, and tell Dr. Reyes I want a second opinion on the neurological assessment." He hung up and looked at the empty document still open on his laptop, the one he'd started after the footage with the classification header he'd deleted because nothing he typed was accurate. He looked at it for a moment. Then he typed 2 words, stared at them, and closed the laptop without saving. The 2 words were paradigm shift. He didn't keep that kind of language in official files either. 3 blocks from the impact site, the city was doing what cities did, absorbing the damage into the ongoing machinery of itself. Cleanup crews worked under GDA supervision. A story had been prepared, gas main explosion structural failure, a narrative that explained the craters and the overturned vehicles and the bus on its side, without explaining anything that actually needed explaining. Mark stood at the edge of the cordon and watched a crew pulling a section of concrete the size of a dining table out of a storefront window. The concrete had weight behind it. Someone had thrown it, or something had thrown it, in a direction that had terminated at a glass facade. Conquest had not been aiming at the storefront. Conquest had not been aiming at anything in particular except the general concept of demonstrating what happened when something got in his way. 14 injured, Nolan said from behind him. None critical. Mark didn't turn around. I know. Cecil's office sent the update. It could have been significantly worse. It was bad enough. Mark watched the crew work. The storefront had been a pharmacy. The owner was talking to a GDA agent in a calm professional voice that had the specific flatness of someone who had decided that the alternative to professional calm was a complete breakdown and who had chosen, for now, to defer the breakdown. I couldn't stop him. I kept hitting him, and he stopped. I've fought Viltrumites before. You've never fought Conquest. Is there a difference? Nolan came to stand beside him. Yes. He looked at the cleanup operation without expression. Conquest is what happens when a Viltrumite stops caring about anything except the work. He's been doing this for longer than most human civilizations have existed. The gauntlet, the specific techniques, the way he reads an opponent's response to damage those, didn't come from natural ability. Those came from centuries of refining the most efficient methods for breaking things. He paused. You did well to keep him occupied long enough for the situation to resolve. He threw me through a newsstand. Yes. Nolan's mustache shifted slightly. He does that. Mark was quiet for a moment. Rimuru confirmed the bus passengers were alive before letting him leave. I didn't see Rimuru check. I was watching the whole time and I didn't see anything that looked like checking. Nolan said nothing. How does that work? Mark said. It wasn't quite a question. I don't know. But you have a theory. I have an observation. Nolan looked at the space where the geometric pattern had appeared and faded. The air was ordinary now, indistinguishable from any other city air. But something about the memory of what had been there made the eye want to find it anyway. Whatever Rimuru uses to do, what Rimuru does, it extends further than the visible effects. The range, the depth of information, it's not consistent with any power set I've encountered. Not Viltrumite, not any species in Coalition records. He stopped there. Not because he had run out of observations, but because the next sentence would have been about what that implied, and the implications were large enough that he wasn't sure the middle of a cleanup operation was the right place to say them. Mark looked at him. "Say it." Nolan looked at his son briefly, directly in the way of someone who had decided that the alternative to honesty was a worse problem down the line. "What I've seen Rimuru do," he said, "would make the Viltrumite Empire significantly less confident about the outcome of a direct engagement." The cleanup crew pulled another chunk of concrete from the storefront. The pharmacy owner's calm, professional voice continued its conversation with the GDA agent. Mark turned that over for a while. "That's a careful way to say what you mean." "I'm being careful." "Why?" "Because what I actually mean," Nolan said, "is that if Thrag has seen even half of what I saw today, he's not going to stop. He's going to accelerate. A threat that could genuinely challenge the Empire's military capacity is not something Thrag responds to by backing down. It's something he responds to by committing everything he has before the threat can grow any larger." The words sat in the air between them with the weight of someone who had spent 4 centuries inside the machine, describing accurately what the machine was about to do. Rimuru was waiting for them. Not at the cordon, not at the cleanup site at a point 3 blocks east and 8 stories up, standing on the edge of a rooftop, with the ease of someone for whom the distinction between a roof and a floor was primarily semantic. The noon light caught silver hair and made it look for a moment like something that belonged to a different and quieter story than the one currently in progress. Cecil's voice came through Mark's earpiece. "I'm watching." Mark landed on the rooftop. Nolan came in behind him and stayed back slightly, not deferential, just reading the space before committing to a position in it. "Conquest is in GDA medical custody," Mark said. "Cecil's team is assessing him." "I know." Rimuru had not turned. The gaze was on the city, on the 3 blocks of damage visible from here. "His neurological function is intact. The physical restrictions will last approximately 72 hours. "Adam," Mark said. You already knew the timeline. CL confirmed it this morning. This morning. Mark did the math on when the engagement had ended and how much time had passed, and what this morning implied about the speed at which Rimuru processed follow-up assessments on incapacitated Viltrumite warriors. He stopped doing the math because the answer was making his stomach uncomfortable. "What does keeping him alive give you?" Nolan said. It was not an accusation. It was the question of someone who had made similar calculations before and was checking whether the logic matched. Rimuru turned. The amber gaze moved to Nolan with a directness that had nothing aggressive in it and nothing comfortable, either the attention of something assessing the accuracy of the question. "A 72-hour window," Rimuru said, "before the Empire knows whether Conquest can tell them anything useful about what he encountered. CL has been going through what he carries. By the time he's capable of a coherent debrief, most of it will be noise." Nolan absorbed that. "You're degrading the intelligence value while maintaining the signal." Rimuru looked back at the city. "If I'd killed him, Thrag gets a clear message the target eliminates threats. If Conquest returns damaged, an incoherent Thrag gets a much more expensive question. What exactly happened? And why can't his best asset explain it?" The logic was clean. Mark could follow it. What he was less comfortable with was how naturally it arrived. How the calculation of letting someone survive in a specifically degraded state for the purpose of creating maximum uncertainty in an enemy's decision-making process came out of Rimuru's mouth with no more weight than a weather observation. "That's not mercy," Mark said. "No," Rimuru agreed. "It's not." The honesty of it sat there, without apology. Mark didn't push it further because there was nothing dishonest about it that deserved pushing. And because the pharmacy owner 3 blocks away was still giving her statement, and the cleanup crew was still working, and 14 people were in the hospital. And honest cruelty in service of preventing worse cruelty was a calculation Mark had started doing himself, and hated, and had not yet found a way to stop. Cecil's voice. "We need to talk about the next 48 hours," Nolan said. "The relay going dark will have reached Thrag's desk by now. Conquest's condition on top of that Thrag isn't going to sit with those 2 data points and wait. He's going to read them as a declaration of capability." "Which it is," Cecil said flat, "whether we intended it or not." "I intended it," Rimuru said. The comm went quiet. Mark watched Cecil's silence even filtered through an earpiece. Cecil's silences had textures, and this one had the texture of a man revising a fundamental assumption. "You wanted him to accelerate," Cecil said. "I wanted clarity." Rimuru's voice carried the weight of someone who had thought this through far enough that the thinking had stopped feeling like a burden. An empire that's deciding whether to treat you as a threat moves slowly and carefully. An empire that's already decided commits resources. Committed resources can be located. Located resources can be addressed. A beat the interior kind brief. Cecil is tracking 3 additional relay signatures in the outer system. We'll know more in 6 hours. Mark heard the implications of that sentence land in Nolan's expression before Nolan said anything. The slight adjustment of weight, the specific stillness of someone absorbing information that confirmed something they'd feared. 3 relays, Nolan said. "That's not residual surveillance, that's forward positioning." "Yes. They're already staging." "They were staging before I arrived." Rimuru finally looked away from the city and toward both of them. "The question was never whether the war was coming. The question is whether it comes on their schedule or ours." The rooftop was very quiet. 8 stories below the city continued its work of putting itself back together, block by block, with the determined momentum of something that didn't know it was being discussed as a strategic variable. Cecil said, "I need to brief the Joint Chiefs, and I need something I can tell them that doesn't cause a panic. Tell them the threat has been assessed and countermeasures are in development," Rimuru said. "That's not entirely false," Cecil said slowly. "No, it isn't." Another silence. Mark looked at Rimuru, at the slight build and the simple clothing, and the silver hair that the afternoon wind was currently doing nothing dramatic to, and tried to reconcile the optics with the conversation, and found, as he had found several times in the past 24 hours, that the reconciliation refused to come. He thought about what Nolan had said about the Empire accelerating. He thought about 3 relay signatures in the outer system. He thought about a pharmacy owner using the same even tone she'd maintained since the first responders arrived, still choosing not to fall apart yet. "If they come in numbers," he said, "what happens?" Rimuru looked at him. "Then it stops being a question of defense," Rimuru said. Mark held that. It was not the answer to the question he'd asked, and it was exactly the answer to the question he'd meant. 6 hours, Nolan said. "Then we know more." "Then we know more," Rimuru agreed. Below, a cleanup crew foreman called out measurements for the concrete removal. And someone wrote them down, and the city kept working because cities did that. They kept working even when the ground under them had quietly shifted into something no one had a map for yet. The first strike hit Sao Paulo at 3:14 a.m. local time. Not a single Viltrumite. 4 moving in a dispersed formation that had clearly been designed to prevent any single response from addressing more than 2 of them simultaneously. They came down through the lower atmosphere at different angles and different speeds, which meant the GDA's early warning system, built around the assumption of a single incoming object, registered them as separate events with a 17-second lag between the first alert and the full picture. 17 seconds was enough for two of them to reach the ground. The damage from the initial impacts alone displaced 3 city blocks. Not a precision strike. A pressure test. Cecil had the picture 40 seconds after the first alert, which was 11 seconds faster than the system was supposed to be capable of, because he had been awake since before the Sao Paulo event and had already been running the incoming data from the 3 relay signatures Rimuru had identified the previous evening. He had not slept. He had been building models. Every model he built told him the same thing. "Invincible," he said into the comm. "Sao Paulo, now, and get me Nolan."
Battle.
Mark was over the Atlantic when the second strike registered this 1 Jakarta, 2 Viltrumites infrastructure targets. Power grid and port facilities, which was not the pattern of a force trying to maximize civilian casualties. It was the pattern of a force trying to maximize disruption while minimizing the kind of footage that unified planetary resistance. They were thinking. He pushed harder and hit the Sao Paulo perimeter in 4 minutes, dropping into the wreckage of what had been a commercial district and was now a series of craters connected by debris fields. The 4 Viltrumites had spread across a 2-kilometer radius. Mark took the nearest one. It went poorly, then adequately, then poorly again. The Viltrumite he engaged was not Conquest, not in age or refinement, but it was significantly more experienced than the scouts from the lake, and it had clearly been briefed on Mark's fighting style because it kept pulling him toward angles that exposed his back to the second nearest Viltrumite's vector. Mark spent the first 90 seconds being managed instead of fighting, and the second 90 seconds figuring out how to stop being managed. He was working on the third 90 seconds when the air above the commercial district changed. Not all of it. A specific volume, roughly cylindrical, maybe 200 meters in diameter, centered over the highest density civilian shelter that the GDA's emergency system had flagged 6 minutes prior. The air inside that volume did something that Mark, watching from 200 meters away, while a Viltrumite tried to reposition his shoulder, could not describe accurately and would not attempt to describe accurately later. What he could say was that the Viltrumite moving toward that cylinder from the north hit its edge at full speed and stopped. Not the Viltrumite kept moving. Its momentum continued. But the vector changed subtly, and without any visible mechanism, redirected along the cylinder's exterior surface and away from the civilian concentration inside. The Viltrumite spent approximately 3 seconds being confused by this. Then it tried again. Same result. The momentum redirected smooth and absolute, like water finding the path of least resistance, except that in this case the path had been decided by something else entirely. The Viltrumite from Mark's engagement disengaged and moved toward the cylinder. Mark went after it, caught it, and drove it into a building that had already been evacuated, which was not a coincidence. He had noticed that the buildings still registering as occupied were uniformly outside the impact radius of the current engagement, a distribution that had not been accidental. CL's managing the civilian grid, Rimuru said in his ear through a channel Mark had not opened and had not known existed. Mark threw the Viltrumite through 2 load-bearing walls. I figured. Jakarta is contained. Nolan has the southern vector. There's a third front opening. Where? Mumbai. GDA is 17 minutes out. You're 4. Mark looked at the Viltrumite pulling itself out of the rubble. It was functional. It was also between him and Mumbai. I'm a little busy. Finish it. He did. It took 8 minutes instead of 4 because the Viltrumite was better than it looked, and because 2 of those minutes involved preventing a partial building collapse from adding to the casualty count. When he cleared Mumbai airspace, the front there was already partially contained one Viltrumite down, one engaged by what turned out to be an Unopan in a coalition fighter configuration, who introduced himself briefly as Alan. "You're the Earth one," Alan said, taking a hit from the remaining Viltrumite and shrugging it off with the cheerful stoicism of someone who had been taking hits for a living for a long time. "Good timing." "You too." Mark came in from the flank. "How long have you been here?" 3 minutes. Got a signal from someone about a multi-vector engagement and decided Earth seemed like it needed help. He ducked a strike that would have removed his head. Also, I was in the neighborhood. They put the Mumbai Viltrumite down in 6 minutes, which was faster than either of them would have managed alone and slower than either of them wanted to admit. Cecil watched 9 simultaneous feeds, 4 in South America, 2 in Southeast Asia, 1 in the Indian subcontinent, 1 over the Pacific of Viltrumite, moving toward what the GDA's threat matrix had identified as a military satellite cluster, and one that was not on Earth at all. A signal that Alan's coalition equipment was broadcasting from somewhere in the outer atmosphere, marking a Viltrumite intercept he had handled before making planetfall. 9 fronts, all opened within a 40-minute window. The GDA's rapid response architecture had been built over the past 3 months to handle 2 simultaneous events. 4 if all assets were perfectly positioned. 9 was not a number the architecture had been designed to process. It was processing them anyway, because someone had rerouted the priority logic in the emergency coordination system at 3:09 a.m. 5 minutes before the first Sao Paulo strike, and the rerouted logic was significantly better than what Cecil's team had written. He had not authorized that reroute. He watched it work. He watched the civilian evacuation corridors activate in the correct sequence, watched the shelter designations, update in real time as the threat vectors shifted, watched the response asset assignments redirect twice in 40 seconds as new information arrived. Each redirect more efficient than the one before shaving. Seconds off response windows that in the current environment were the difference between evacuated and not evacuated. He had not written that logic either. "Someone rewrote my emergency coordination system," he said to the room. His lead technical analyst looked up. "It started at 3:09. We didn't catch it until the reroute was already live." She paused. "The new logic is, sir, it's significantly better than ours." "I know." Cecil looked at the 9 feeds. "Don't touch it." She stared at him. "Sir, don't touch it." He watched the Pacific satellite vector resolve the Viltrumite. They're stopped at an altitude Cecil's instruments couldn't explain, held in place by something that didn't show on any of his sensor bands, and then redirected toward the nearest landmass at a speed that suggested it had been given a very specific destination and a very clear instruction to reach it. "We can audit it after." After there was an after? He was fairly confident of that now, which was something he had not been fully confident of at 3:14 a.m. He pulled up the comm to Rimuru's channel, the one that had appeared in his system at 3:09 alongside the coordination reroute, also without his authorization. 7 of 9 fronts resolved, he said. 8, Rimuru said. The Pacific vector is contained. Cecil checked his feeds. The Pacific feed showed the Viltrumite grounded on a Pacific island that was also a GDA monitoring station, which meant it had been landed precisely where Cecil's people could process it. Mumbai, Alan and Invincible, 90 seconds out. 90 seconds. Cecil ran the numbers on what that meant for the timeline of the next probable wave. If they send another round, they won't. Not tonight. A beat the interior kind, the brief withdrawal that Cecil had started to recognize as the signature of a secondary process completing. CL is tracking the withdrawal pattern. They got what they came for, which was response time, coverage radius, How many fronts before the coordination breaks? Cecil looked at his 9 feeds 8, resolving one finishing. And what did they learn? The answer came back even and flat. That the coordination doesn't break. Cecil found to his considerable irritation that he had no response to that which wasn't either redundant or sentimental. He closed the channel and looked at his screen. Mark landed on a rooftop in what remained of the commercial district cleared, but marked with the kind of structural damage that said, "Do not occupy," and meant it and took stock. He was intact, bruised across the ribs where the Sao Paulo Viltrumite had found an angle he hadn't covered. Left shoulder running at about 80%, which was better than it had felt 20 minutes ago. He had put down 2 Viltrumites, helped contain a third, and spent a significant portion of the last hour being managed by an empire that had clearly done its homework on what Mark Grayson did when he was scared and outnumbered. He had spent the last 20 minutes being managed by something else. Not Rimuru directly. Not orders, not a handler. Something more like a current, a persistent redirection of where it made sense to be and what it made sense to do, delivered via the coordination logic and the channel in his ear, always ahead of where his instincts were pointing, always landing him in the place where his specific capacity was actually needed, rather than the place where the loudest problem was. He was a better fighter when he wasn't deciding where to fight. He wasn't sure how he felt about that. Nolan dropped in from the northeast landing with the ease of someone who had not spent the last hour absorbing hits. He had a cut across his forearm that was already closing. That was the full extent of his damage. "Southern vectors clear," he said. 2 contained, 1 withdrew before engagement. The one that withdrew knew it was being tracked, made a decision. Nolan looked across the damaged skyline. They're learning the pattern. Remuru said they got what they came for. Go on. Response time and coverage radius. Nolan sat on the edge of the rooftop's safety railing, which was not designed for his mass, and looked at the city. They're building a model. Tonight was data collection. Data collection that killed 11, I know. The numbers sat between them, with the specific density of something that couldn't be argued with. 8 wounded critically. The shelter in Sao Paulo took a structural hit that the cylinder didn't fully intercept. 3 people didn't make it to the evacuation corridor in time. He looked at Mark. It could have been 3,000. Mark knew that. He had known it while it was happening, the constant background math of what the casualty count would be if the coordination broke, if the cylinders failed, if Rimuru had been a minute later or a meter off. The math had been running the entire time, underneath everything else. And it had kept producing a number that made tonight's actual count feel like a narrow escape. "If there's another wave," he said. "There will be." Nolan said it without effect. "Not tonight, but there will be. And if it's bigger?" Nolan didn't answer immediately. He looked at the skyline, at the lights that were coming back on in the undamaged districts, at the thin line of orange on the eastern horizon that meant morning was coming whether or not anyone had slept. "Then we'd better make sure the coordination holds," he said. Alan descended from above and landed beside them, with considerably more noise than Nolan and considerably more enthusiasm. "So," he said, "I take it this is the new normal?" He looked at the damage, then at Nolan, then at Mark. "I've been briefed on the situation. Coalition sent me ahead of the full assessment team." A beat. "The full assessment team is worried?" "About the Viltrumite engagement," Mark said. "About what's coordinating the response." Alan's single eye tracked across the skyline, in the same direction Nolan had been looking. "There's a signal pattern in the emergency coordination traffic that our equipment flagged as non-human in origin. Coalition Technical Division spent 20 minutes trying to classify it." He paused. "They couldn't. The three of them stood on the rooftop while the city rebuilt itself below them and the sky lightened in the east. Somewhere in the wreckage of the commercial district, 3 sets of GDA containment teams were processing 2 incapacitated Viltrumites and trying to explain to each other and to their filing systems what exactly had happened to the air above the civilian shelter. And in the space between the coordination feeds and the withdrawal patterns and the 11 names that would go into the morning reports, something was already tracking the next wave. Its probable timing, its likely vectors, the point at which the current response architecture would stop being sufficient. 3 seconds to mass casualty threshold on the next wave would be 1 second fewer than tonight. 1 second fewer was not a margin anyone on that rooftop was comfortable with. The planet was called Sereth. Coalition-aligned, mid-tier development, roughly 40 million inhabitants across 2 primary landmasses and a chain of island settlements. It had been flagged in the outer relay sweep as a potential Viltrum soft target close enough to a major coalition supply route to have strategic value far enough from any rapid response asset to make defense difficult. Cecil had noted the risk. Rimuru had logged it. The contingency plan had put Sereth in the 2nd tier of response priority behind Earth and 3 other inhabited systems closer to known Viltrum staging positions. 2nd tier meant if the situation develops, respond within 8 minutes. 8 minutes had been the number. It had seemed reasonable. Mark found out about Sereth 40 minutes after the fact in a GDA briefing room with a screen showing satellite imagery that had been transmitted by an automated coalition monitoring buoy before anyone with authority to suppress it could make that call. The images had been in the Coalition's emergency broadcast system for 11 minutes before Cecil's office flagged them for restriction. By that point, they had been received by every Coalition-aligned station within relay range. He looked at the images for a long time without saying anything. The transfer took Rimuru 3 seconds longer than it should have. That was what Cecil told him in the clinical shorthand they used when the information mattered more than the framing. 3 seconds over the projected window, because the dislocation range was at the outer limit of what the current distribution of active operations could support. And the 3 active Earth-side containment fields had required a partial reallocation before the transfer could complete. 3 seconds. Mark was still looking at the satellite images when Rimuru landed on Sereth's surface in what had been the largest settlement on the northern continent and began moving through what remained. He heard about it later from Alan, who had arrived 12 minutes after Rimuru, and who described in a voice that had lost most of its usual affect what the settlement looked like when he got there. No fires. The Viltrumites hadn't been trying to burn anything. Fire would have been visible from orbit for hours, would have given the Coalition time to organize, might have made the story legible to people who needed things to be legible before they reacted. Instead, the settlement had been addressed the way a Viltrumite elite unit addressed soft targets, when speed and silence were the operational requirements, quickly, thoroughly, and with the specific efficiency of something that had been doing this for a very long time, and had stopped thinking of it as anything other than work. Alan said the hardest part was how quiet it was. Mark was in the briefing room when Rimuru came back. He knew Rimuru had returned because the air pressure in the building changed slightly. A barely perceptible shift that he'd started to recognize as the signature of spatial transit at close range. And then Rimuru was standing in the corridor outside the briefing room, visible through the glass partition. The silver-blue hair was undisturbed, the simple clothing showed nothing. The amber gaze was fixed on the middle distance, in a way that had nothing to do with the wall it appeared to be directed at. Mark pushed the briefing room door open. He started to say something and didn't. There wasn't anything that wouldn't have been smaller than what both of them had just been looking at. Nolan was already in the corridor. He'd arrived from a separate transfer 2 minutes prior, having been pulled from an outer system liaison meeting by the same alert. He looked at Rimuru and said nothing for a moment either. Then he said quietly, This is what they do when they want to make something clear. Rimuru's gaze shifted to him. They weren't trying to win a battle, Nolan continued. They were sending a message about what happens to anything that supports resistance. Sereth had been publicly aligned with coalition anti-Viltrum activity for 8 months. He paused. They've done this before. Different planets, same logic. You make the cost of resistance so visible that the next planet in line decides cooperation is the better choice. How many times? Mark said. Nolan looked at his son. Enough that there's a term for it in Imperial doctrine. The corridor was quiet. Somewhere in the building, a door opened and closed. The ventilation system ran at its normal frequency. The containment fields, Mark said to Rimuru. You had them running on Earth. That's why it took longer to get to Sereth. Yes. If you dropped the Earth fields, Earth would have been exposed for the duration of the transfer and re-establishment. Rimuru said it without effect, which was not the same as without weight. Cecil calculated the exposure window. It was 11 minutes. 11 minutes. Mark had spent enough time in the last 72 hours doing triage arithmetic to know exactly what 11 minutes of uncontested Viltrum access to a populated planet looked like. So you chose, Mark said. Yes. There was no apology in it. Mark hadn't expected one, and the absence of it was not the problem. The problem was that the choice had been correct by every measure he could apply, and had still produced a planet full of bodies, and the two things were simultaneously true in a way that he didn't have anywhere to put. He thought about Cecil in the GDA Operations Center, 3 floors down, who had not yet been fully briefed on Sereth because the information was still moving through channels, who was at this moment probably reviewing the latest round of Earthside data and making his own calculations, who had spent a career making exactly these kinds of choices, and who Mark had spent a significant amount of time judging for making them. He kept the thought to himself. Cecil's voice reached Rimuru at a frequency only the two of them shared. Mark saw the moment it happened, saw the slight shift of attention, the brief withdrawal behind the amber eyes, the return that was always a fraction more complete than the departure. Whatever had been said, it had taken approximately 4 seconds and had clearly been in the nature of a report rather than a conversation. Rimuru looked at Nolan, then at Mark. Cecil has completed the analysis of Sereth's engagement timeline and cross-referenced it against the broader operational data from the last 72 hours. The words came out level with the specific quality of someone reading a conclusion that had taken a long time to reach and had arrived exactly where they'd expected it to. Civilian loss under the current operational posture exceeds the sustainable threshold by a factor of 3. If the Empire retains its current strike capacity and we continue to respond reactively, the projected outcome over the next 60 days is not a war. It's an attrition. Meaning what? Mark said. Meaning we lose. Slowly and in ways that look like individual tragedies until they stop looking like anything at all. Rimuru looked at Nolan. You know this model. Nolan's jaw was set. Yes. They used it before, on planets that were harder to break than Sereth. Yes. The corridor held that for a moment. Mark said, So what changes? Rimuru turned to look at him directly, not the assessing regard from their first meeting, not the strategic attention from the rooftop, but something harder than either. The look of someone who had finished a calculation and was now on the other side of it. The approach, Rimuru said. What we've been doing is trying to keep the war contained. Keep it here, keep it manageable, minimize the cost per engagement. A beat. That was the right approach for as long as it worked. It stopped working on Sereth. Mark said, And now? Rimuru held his gaze for a moment. Now we go after what makes the war possible, Rimuru said. Supply lines, command infrastructure, the architecture that lets them move assets and coordinate strikes, not the soldiers, the system. Nolan was quiet, reading the implications of that, with the expression of a man who had spent 400 years on the other side of exactly this kind of decision. That's not defense, Mark said. No. Rimuru agreed. It isn't. Mark held that. He thought about Sereth, the quiet, the speed, the 40 million people who had woken up that morning on a planet that was doing fine and had not gone to sleep. He thought about the pharmacy owner in Sao Paulo 3 days ago, using the same even tone she'd maintained since the first responders arrived. He thought about what Cecil had said once in a tone so stripped of effect it had sounded almost compassionate. I'd make a deal with the devil if it meant the safety of the planet. He had not understood that sentence when he heard it. He was beginning to. Okay, he said. Rimuru looked at him, that same unreadable attention. Okay, Mark said again. Quieter this time. Not agreement exactly. Acknowledgement. The specific acknowledgement of someone who had run the numbers themselves and arrived at the same place and hated it and was going to do it anyway. Nolan said, "If you go after the infrastructure, Thrag will respond differently than he has so far. This stops being a probe and becomes an existential engagement for the Empire." "I know," Rimuru said. "You're ready for that?" Rimuru looked at the wall for a moment, at the glass partition, showing the empty briefing room. The still screen, the images that had already been restricted, but that all three of them had already seen. "Ciel Mount," Rimuru said to the frequency that only they shared. Mark couldn't hear the answer. He watched Rimuru's expression, the slight withdrawal that returned the door that had been open for 3 days, closing very quietly. "Begin targeting the supply architecture," Rimuru said. "Start with the relay chains feeding the outer staging positions." It was not shouted. It was not a declaration. It was the way you said the thing that didn't need to be said dramatically, because the weight was already in it, and adding anything else would have been dishonest. The corridor stayed quiet. Outside, the city continued its business unaware. 3 floors down, Cecil was reviewing Earthside metrics and had not yet received the Sereth report. Somewhere in the outer system, the relay chain Ciel had just begun mapping continued their quiet work of holding an Empire's war machine together. For approximately 4 more hours. The first loss was a relay node. Thrag received the report at 0340 shipboard time, TR. R12 outer system signal termination, identical to TR7. Instantaneous. No debris signature, no energy discharge, no record of incoming attack on any sensor band. The node had simply ceased to exist as a functioning object. He had logged it and moved on. 2 relay losses in the same window was notable, but not catastrophic. The Empire had redundancy built into its surveillance architecture for exactly this kind of attrition. The second loss was a fleet coherence node. This was different. Fleet coherence nodes were not passive surveillance infrastructure. They were the active coordination network that allowed Viltrum strike elements to operate as a unified force rather than a collection of individuals. Losing one did not disable a fleet. It made the fleet slower, less responsive, prone to the kind of coordination lag that against most opponents was irrelevant. Against an opponent that appeared to be operating with near-perfect situational awareness, coordination lag was not irrelevant. Thrag noted the second loss. He began adjusting his war posture. The third, fourth, and fifth losses arrived within a 6-minute window. 3 more coherence nodes, 1 logistics relay, 1 forward staging depot that had been in operation for 11 years and had been considered until 40 minutes ago beyond any reasonable threat range. The depot's destruction was clean in a way that troubled Thrag more than spectacular destruction would have. No explosion, no impact signature. The facility had been active, and then it had not been active, and the transition between those two states had left no evidence of mechanism. Thrag pulled his senior tactical officer from whatever she had been doing and had her run the loss pattern. She came back in 9 minutes with a report that Thrag read twice. The losses were not random. They were not opportunistic. They mapped with a precision that required either extraordinary intelligence collection or real-time visibility into Viltrum's war architecture onto the exact nodes that, if removed in this sequence, would degrade the Empire's response reach in the outer system by approximately 60% over the next 72 hours. Someone had looked at Viltrum's war machine and identified its structural joints and was now removing those joints in the order that would cause maximum cascading disruption. Not maximum immediate damage. Maximum cascading disruption. Thrag set the report down. He had been a military commander for longer than most civilizations had existed. He had fought wars of attrition, wars of annihilation, wars of conquest, and wars of suppression. He had seen every variety of strategic approach that the inhabited systems could produce. He had never in that entire span encountered an opponent that appeared to understand the Viltrum war machine better than the people who had built it. "Get me a status on all active elements," he said. "Full count. Every position, every vector." His officer began the work. Thrag walked to the viewport of the command vessel and looked at the stars. 6 losses became 9 by the time the full status report came in. The pattern had continued. Each removed node sat precisely at the intersection of 2 or more dependency chains, so that its absence forced every connected element to reroute, recalculate, and temporarily reduce its response tempo while the rerouting completed. The rerouting itself was being disrupted. 2 of the backup relay paths had been removed in the same 6-minute window as the primary losses, which suggested that whoever was doing this had already mapped the redundancy architecture and had pre-targeted the fallback options. Thrag's tactical officer presented the full picture with the professional flatness of someone delivering bad news to a person who was known to respond poorly to editorial commentary. "We're looking to Banturi, she said, at an opponent with complete visibility into our command architecture and the reach to act on that visibility faster than our response systems can compensate. "I know what we're looking at," Thrag said. "Then you know that at the current rate of attrition, the outer system's strike reach will be functionally compromised within 40 hours, not destroyed. Compromised. The units will still be there. They will not be able to coordinate effectively enough to operate as a unified force." Thrag was not given to the kind of reaction that showed on the surface. What moved through him processing the report was colder than anger and more dangerous than fear. The cold recalibration of a commander who had just been shown that the war he thought he was fighting was not the war currently in progress. He had sent Conquest to measure the target's ceiling. He had learned that the ceiling was high. The escalation had followed the multi-vector saturation method that had broken planetary resistance on 17 separate occasions. He had watched it fail to break the coordination holding Earth's defenses. He had used Sereth to demonstrate the cost of support because the cost of support demonstration had broken coalition solidarity on 4 previous occasions, and because breaking solidarity was faster and cheaper than fighting a sustained war. He had watched the target absorb the demonstration and change its war posture within the same rotation. And now, the target was not waiting to be attacked. It was inside his command architecture, removing the components that made coordinated attack possible, with the systematic patience of something that understood military logistics as well as any Viltrum commander alive. Thrag pulled up the surveillance feed from the one remaining outer system node that had not yet been removed. The feed showed normal space, stars, the distant edge of a planetary system. Nothing that explained what was happening to his network. "Where is it?" he said. His officer understood the question. "We don't know. There's no transit signature, no energy profile that would let us track movement. Whatever it's doing, it isn't generating a detectable footprint." "It's inside our architecture," Thrag said. "Yes. Which means it knows our sensor bands well enough to operate below them." "Yes." Thrag looked at the feed for another moment. Then he closed it. The stars were not useful information. "Draft a recall order for the outer system elements," he said. "Pull them back to the secondary staging positions. We reorganize around what we have not, what we've lost." "And the target." Thrag had been the Grand Regent of the Viltrum Empire for longer than any other living entity had held comparable power in the known systems. He had reached that position by being in a field of exceptionally capable competitors. The one who most consistently read situations correctly and acted on those readings without the distortions of ego or sentiment. He read the current situation. "The target," he said, "is not trying to kill us. It's trying to make us incapable of fighting, which means it has objectives beyond this war." He turned from the viewport. "Find out what those objectives are, and pull the elements back. I won't commit forces to an engagement where our coordination strength is being actively degraded in real time." His officer left to begin the recall process. Thrag stood in the command center of his vessel and understood with the clarity that came from reading situations correctly over a very long career that he had been operating under a false assumption. He had been treating the entity on Earth as a powerful combatant with unusual abilities. It was not a combatant. It was a campaign. On Earth, Cecil watched the feeds. The GDA's recalibrated sensor arrays, the ones that had been upgraded with parameters provided by Rimuru's 309 AM system access, which Cecil had stopped being angry about, somewhere around the 5th relay termination, were painting a picture that Cecil's analytical training kept trying to contextualize and kept failing to. The Viltrum outer system network was collapsing. Not in the way that networks collapsed when they were attacked by overwhelming force. No explosions, no debris, clouds, no sensor-saturating energy discharges. It was collapsing the way a building collapsed when the load-bearing elements were removed in the right sequence, quietly, structurally, in a way that left the surface intact while the internal coherence failed. His lead analyst had pulled the loss pattern and overlaid it on what they knew of Viltrum's war architecture from Nolan's debriefs. The match was near perfect. "This is not," she said, "a military campaign. This is an engineering problem being solved." Cecil looked at the overlay. "I know. Whoever is doing this understands the Viltrum military structure at a level that... I know." She stopped talking. Cecil kept looking at the overlay. He had spent his career preparing for threats and managing them. He had built systems, cultivated assets, made decisions that he would not be able to justify publicly, but that had on balance kept the planet functioning. He had operated on the assumption that with sufficient preparation, any threat could be managed. The overlay showed him something his assumption did not account for. Not a threat being managed. A war being ended not by defeating the enemy in the field, but by removing the enemy's ability to wage war as a coherent activity. The approach required a level of situational awareness and surgical precision that no Earth-based system could replicate. He thought about what would happen to the galactic balance of power if Viltrum's military capability was permanently degraded. He thought about what would happen if the entity currently degrading it decided that Earth was the next problem to solve. He thought about the fact that the entity had not done that, and that the entity had instead spent the past week defending Earth at considerable strategic cost to itself, and that this was either because the entity had principled reasons for doing so, or because Earth was not yet worth the effort, and that he genuinely could not determine which of those two explanations was correct. Nolan appeared in the doorway of the operations center. He had been watching the same feeds from a different terminal. "This hasn't happened before," Nolan said. Cecil looked at him. "No. Viltrum has fought every kind of opponent. Superior numbers, superior technology, unusual abilities, strategic brilliance." Nolan's jaw set in the way Cecil had started to recognize as the tell of a man processing something that contradicted 4 centuries of experience. They've never fought something that understood their own doctrine better than they did. Cecil said nothing. "It's not going to stop," Nolan said. "Not until the war capability is gone or until Thrag finds a way to engage on different terms." "What different terms are available to him?" Nolan looked at the overlay. "None that I can see. That's the point." That's it. Mark watched Rimuru from 15 meters. The silver-haired youth was standing at the edge of the GDA rooftop, the same one they'd used 3 days ago, chosen, again because it was clear, and had good bearing on the orbital sectors Ciel was currently working through and was doing nothing visible. No movement, no apparent effort, just the amber gaze directed at a precise bearing in the sky, and the periodic shift of attention that Mark had come to understand as the signature of something happening at a distance that the eye couldn't follow. He had been watching for 40 minutes. In those 40 minutes, according to the feed Cecil was running in the operations center, 2 floors below 11 nodes in the Viltrum outer system network had been removed from active status. No sound, no light, no indication from this rooftop that anything was happening at all. This was, Mark thought, the most frightening thing he had ever watched. Not because it was violent, it was not violent, or at least not in any register he could perceive. Because it was so completely outside the grammar of how power was supposed to work. Power was supposed to be loud. It was supposed to leave marks. It was supposed to announce itself in ways that let you understand what was happening and prepare for the next thing. This announced nothing. It simply altered the state of the universe at a distance, in ways that the universe's other inhabitants discovered only when they went to use the things that had been altered and found them gone. Rimuru turned. The amber gaze moved to Mark with the same unreadable attention it always carried. And Mark had been around it long enough now to read the texture of it, to know the difference between the processing attention and the strategic attention and the attention that meant a decision had just been completed. This was the last one. "The outer staging network is compromised," Rimuru said. "Thrag is pulling his elements back." Mark exhaled. "And that buys us time, not safety." The silver-haired youth looked back at the sky. "He'll reorganize. He'll look for different terms. He's too good a commander to keep pressing a method that's failing." A beat, not the interior withdrawal this time, just the weight of what came next. But reorganizing around degraded strength takes longer than deploying at full strength. We have a window. To do what? Rimuru's answer was not immediate. The gaze stayed on the sky, on the particular bearing where nothing visible was happening and had been happening for 40 minutes. "To make the window permanent," Rimuru said. Below them, in the GDA Operations Center, Cecil closed the overlay and opened a new file. He typed a header. He stared at it for a long time. Then, for the first time since the night the sky cracked over Chicago, he left it. The header read Post-Conflict Galactic Order Preliminary Assessment. He had not yet written anything below it. But he had not deleted it either. Battlebeast found the Viltrumite 300 kilometers north of the main engagement zones, moving at altitude in the direction of open space with the urgent bearing of something that had decided the current situation was no longer survivable. He dropped in front of it. The Viltrumite was large, well-armed, bleeding from 2 places, and clearly in no condition to entertain complications. It tried to go around him. Battlebeast was faster. It tried to go through him. Battlebeast hit it hard enough to send it into a mountain face, which held for approximately 2 seconds before the Viltrumite punched its way back out with the kind of mechanical determination that came from being bred to survive. Battlebeast grabbed it before it could fully orient and pinned it one clawed hand around its throat to the rock. "The thing doing this," he said. "Where?" The Viltrumite had enough surviving instinct to understand that the white-furred entity holding it against a mountain face was not affiliated with anything that had attacked it today, and that providing information was the better arithmetic. It told him what it knew. Coordinates bearing the general shape of what was happening to the outer staging infrastructure. The word it used for the entity was not a word. It was a gap, where a word should have been filled with the texture of something a 400-year-old soldier could not bring itself to classify. Battlebeast listened. Then he let the Viltrumite go because it was no longer interesting, and turned toward the bearing it had given him. Something out there was taking an empire apart. He had been hunting worthy opponents across 6 systems for longer than most species had kept written records. He had killed things that were worshipped. He had destroyed things that were feared. He had walked away from wars because wars were not fights. They were logistics and ideology, and the long tedium of force deployed at scale, and none of that interested him. What interested him was the moment when 2 things collided at the limit of what either of them could do, and only one walked away. He had not found that moment in a very long time. He moved toward the bearing at speed. Mark saw Battlebeast before Battlebeast saw Rimuru. He was holding a perimeter 3 kilometers east of where Rimuru had been working through the last of the outer staging positions when something came in low and fast from the north. Not a ship, not a Viltrumite in the standard configuration. Something larger and built differently, moving with the recklessness of a thing that had decided arrival mattered more than approach. It landed in the middle of the debris field from the previous hour's work and stood up. Mark had been briefed on Battlebeast. He had seen the GDA file. He had read the Coalition's threat assessment, which described Battlebeast as an independent combatant of extraordinary physical capability, with no political affiliation, no traceable origin, and a behavioral profile that could be summarized as Fine's largest available: fight enters. It leaves if fight proves insufficient, does not leave if fight proves sufficient. The file had also noted that Battlebeast had never been observed leaving a fight he considered sufficient. The white-furred figure looked around at the debris at the craters and warped metal and the strange geometric residue that Rimuru's work tended to leave in the air, and made a sound that Mark, from 3 kilometers away, could still hear clearly. It was not a growl. It was not a roar. It was something closer to the exhale of a person who has been searching for something for a very long time and has just found it. Mark started toward them, then stopped. Something in the air had changed. He had been around Rimuru long enough now to feel the shifts, the small alterations in spatial register that preceded a significant expenditure of attention. Whatever Rimuru was currently doing to the staging infrastructure, it had paused. Rimuru had noticed. Dunt. They faced each other across 40 meters of scorched ground. Battlebeast was large in the way that made large feel inadequate as a descriptor, the muscle density of something that had been built for impact and refined by centuries of continuous application. The claws, the mane, the red-shouldered armor that had seen more combat than most militaries. The eyes that moved across Rimuru with an attention that had nothing strategic in it and nothing evaluating in the analytical sense, just the pure, undiluted recognition of something that had been looking for exactly this and was not going to look away. Rimuru stood in simple clothing, with silver hair catching the wind off the debris field, and amber eyes tracking Battlebeast with a depth that meant multiple things were being considered simultaneously. "You're not Viltrum," Rimuru said. "No." Battlebeast rolled his left shoulder, a small preparatory motion. "I don't care about Viltrum." "Then what do you want?" The question was genuine. Not defensive, not diplomatic. Genuinely asking. Battlebeast showed his teeth. "You." He covered the 40 meters in less than a second. The impact was significant enough that Mark felt it from 3 kilometers away, a pressure wave that had nothing to do with explosion and everything to do with 2 objects of extreme mass colliding at extreme speed. The ground between them cracked outward in a ring. The air pressure changed. Something at the edge of the debris field that had been resting unstably fell over. Rimuru had moved the displacement, the spatial repositioning that Mark had watched dozens of times now. The way the silver-haired youth seemed to occupy a slightly different relationship with the geometry of things than everything else but Battlebeast had anticipated it. Not perfectly, but enough to redirect his momentum and follow through, closing the new distance with a combination that came from centuries of learning how things moved when they tried to escape. The second impact was more direct. Mark watched Rimuru take it. Not absorb it, take it in the full physical sense, the hit landing, and the response being to give ground rather than nullify. 4 meters of give, then a stop, then a response that was so much faster than Battlebeast had apparently calculated that he was mid-recovery when it arrived. Battlebeast went through a piece of staging infrastructure that had already been structurally compromised and came back out wearing it as debris and laughed. The sound of it carried across the whole debris field. Not triumph, not aggression, something native to Battlebeast's relationship with violence, the laugh of something in its natural element after a long time in the wrong one. "There it is," Battlebeast said. He went back in. And what followed was not a fight that had the shape of fights Mark had been in. His fights had direction, a problem to solve a threat, to neutralize a duration that corresponded to how long it took to apply sufficient force to the situation. This had none of that. This was 2 things discovering each other's limits in real time, in the way that limits were only truly discovered by running into them at full speed. Battlebeast hit hard enough to leave craters in things that craters were not supposed to be able to exist in. He took hits that would have removed Mark from consciousness and used the momentum to reposition, to close angles, to create new vectors that hadn't existed before the hit arrived. He bled freely, and it made no visible difference to his speed or his enthusiasm. He moved through Rimuru's spatial repositioning not by predicting it, but by creating so many simultaneous angles of approach. That prediction became less relevant than coverage. And he laughed. Continuously. A low, warm, entirely genuine sound that was somehow more disturbing than screaming would have been. Rimuru was not laughing. But Rimuru was also not pulling away. Mark had seen Rimuru in combat before. He had watched the Conquest engagement, had watched the multi-front crisis 3 days ago, had watched the rooftop aftermath of 3 days of sustained warfare. He had never seen Rimuru move like this fully physically, with the kind of direct engagement that left spatial physics as a secondary tool rather than a primary one. Battlebeast had somehow forced a fight that almost happened in the same register as the hitting the close-range exchange of force that was the language of physical combat rather than the language of geometric reconfiguration. It lasted 11 minutes. That was longer than any other single engagement Rimuru had been in since arriving in this verse. The end was clean. Battlebeast had committed to a combination that covered 6 angles simultaneously. The most ambitious thing Mark had watched him attempt, the kind of thing that worked on every opponent who had survived long enough to be worth trying it on. It almost worked. The first 3 strikes of the combination connected. The 4th was the problem. The fourth was the one that contained the full commitment, the all-in-the-moment where everything Battlebeast had was behind one vector. Rimuru was not there. And then, in the space where Battlebeast's momentum was fully extended and fully committed and fully irrecoverable, something happened to the air around him that Mark could not describe in any vocabulary he had. Not spatial repositioning, not a strike in the standard sense. Something that addressed Battlebeast's momentum at the structural level, not redirecting it, but concluding it the way you concluded a sentence rather than interrupted it. Battlebeast came down. Not thrown, not slammed. He came down the way very large things came down, when the thing holding them up was no longer there with gravity and finality, and a sound that the ground absorbed rather than reflected. He was breathing. Mark confirmed that before he crossed the 3 kilometers. When he reached the site, Battlebeast was on his back in the crater his landing had made looking at the sky. The white fur was dark in a dozen places. The mane was tangled with debris. The red-shouldered armor had not survived the last 20 seconds intact. The amber eyes, the expression in them when Battlebeast looked up. Not defeat, not failure. The expression of something that had been given exactly what it asked for, and was measuring the weight of that gift with the full attention of a being for whom this moment was the point of the whole enterprise. "Good," Battlebeast said. His voice was different, lower, emptied of the laugh, carrying something that was not peace exactly, but was in the same territory. "That's the one." Rimuru looked down at him. The silver hair, the simple clothing, the face that was young and not young, and had seen what it needed to see. "You fought well," Rimuru said. It was not offered as comfort. It was offered as fact, which was the only way Battlebeast would have accepted it. Battlebeast exhaled, looked back at the sky. Whatever he was looking at was not the sky. "Yeah," he said. Quieter this time. Mark stood at the edge of the crater and did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't have been smaller than the moment. In the outer system on the command vessel, Thrag received the report on Battlebeast 11 minutes after the engagement concluded. He read it once. Battlebeast had never lost. Not in any record Thrag knew of. Not to Viltrumite strike teams, not to coalition heavy units, not to anything that the inhabited systems had produced in the span of time Battlebeast had been hunting through them. Thrag set the report on the desk beside the other reports. The relay terminations, the staging depot, losses, the fleet coherence failures, the Conquest assessment, the Sereth after-action summary. He looked at the stack for a moment. Every report in it represented something his empire had deployed against the entity on Earth. Everything in the stack had been answered, not stopped by superior force. Answered, each one met with a response precisely calibrated to make the thing impossible to repeat. Thrag had one option left that he had not yet tried. He was not going to like using it. But the stack on his desk was telling him something very clearly. The categories he had been using to think about this problem were all wrong, and every tactic built on wrong categories was going to produce another report for the stack. It was time to change the category. Thrag chose the planet deliberately. Chiron was not a military installation. It was a colonial settlement of 38 million people, a mid-tier agricultural and manufacturing world that had been producing food and industrial materials for the surrounding systems for 2 centuries. It had no meaningful defensive infrastructure, no standing military force, no strategic value beyond its population and its continued operation. It was the kind of place that empires built and maintained and rarely thought about, because places like Chiron were the machinery of civilization, rather than its face. Thrag chose it because it had 38 million people. He had pulled every surviving strike element. The units that had retreated from the outer staging positions before those positions were removed. The assets that had been dispersed across multiple response chains and had not yet been directly engaged. The reserves he had kept in secondary positions, specifically against the possibility of needing them, for something he had not yet needed them for. It was not a large force by the standards of the campaigns that had built the Empire. It was enough. He distributed the force across Kharon's 3 main population centers, interspersed them with the civilian concentrations in ways that made any broad strike geometrically certain to kill colonists, and established a command position in the largest city. Then he sent a signal on the frequency that Cecil had been tracking since the relay terminations began. The signal carried one sentence: "Come and get us, or watch what we do to them." Mark felt sick. He had the feed from Rimuru's GDA-linked monitoring array on his comm, and the feed was showing him a planet with 38 million people and approximately 300 Viltrumites distributed through it, like splinters in flesh close enough to population centers that removing them cleanly required solving a spatial puzzle that had no obvious solution. "He's using the whole planet," Mark said. "Yes." Rimuru's voice came through even and flat, carrying the quality of something that was already past the emotional register of the observation and into the work of solving it. "Cecil has been mapping since the signal arrived. 42 minutes. And it's solvable. It takes time. A beat the interior kind. Thrag knows it takes time. He's going to spend that time making the problem harder." Mark looked at the feed. In the largest city, something was happening in the central district. A Viltrumite unit moving through what the overlay marked as a high-density residential zone, not attacking positioning. Building a wall of geography between themselves and any approach vector. "He's moving them deeper," Mark said. "Yes. So what do we do?" Rimuru looked at him. The amber gaze held the unbroken steadiness of something simultaneously running several problems and had reached conclusions on most of them. "We work from the outside in," Rimuru said. "Strip the population away from the perimeter zones first. Make the problem smaller. Cecil identifies the evacuation routes, and I move people through them before the Viltrumites can close them. And Thrag will push back. He'll try to fill the routes as fast as I open them." Rimuru's gaze returned to the feed overlay. "So we need to be faster." Mark said, "What do I do?" "Northern continent, settlement cluster 7. There are approximately 400,000 people in a zone that Cecil has identified as extractable in the next 18 minutes if someone is physically moving them." Rimuru turned fully to face him. "You won't have Viltrumite resistance there. Thrag underweighted the northern continent because it's lower density. That's the opening." Mark was already moving. Nolan had been watching the feed from a different angle. He had seen Viltrum do this before. Not at this scale. Thrag was using a refinement of a doctrine that had been applied on smaller planets with fewer people in situations where the calculus had been simpler. But the bones were the same. The Empire had discovered over centuries of conquest that the most efficient way to defeat a superior force was to make the superior force's own ethics into a weapon. You put your assets in places where attacking them required accepting an unacceptable cost. Then you waited. It had worked on 7 separate planets that Nolan knew of. On 3 of those planets, the defending force had eventually made the choice to accept the cost and had spent decades afterward trying to live with what they'd done. He did not think it was going to work here. He was not comfortable with the confidence he felt about that. "Southern continent," Rimuru said through the shared channel. "The port city. I need the harbor cleared. There are civilians trapped in the industrial quarter by 2 Viltrumite units. I can handle the units once the civilians aren't between us." "I'll handle getting them out," Nolan said. He went. The port city was called Vareth Dal, and it was burning in 2 places by the time Nolan reached it. Not the industrial quarter, the Viltrumites there had not attacked the trapped civilians. because attacking them would have made them useless as a barrier. They had simply occupied the spaces around them tight enough that any strike would kill the people they were using as insulation. Nolan landed on a rooftop 2 blocks from the perimeter and looked at the situation. 420 people is Reed estimated, packed into 6 interconnected warehouse structures. 2 Viltrumites at the north end, 1 at the south. 2 more on elevated positions covering the main exits. 5 total positioned with the professional efficiency of soldiers who had done this before. He had done this before too. He went in from the west, which was the angle that required the 5 of them to coordinate a response, rather than act independently. And in the time it took that coordination to happen, he had moved 200 people out of the southernmost warehouse through a route that had been briefly unmonitored. The Viltrumites adjusted. He adjusted faster. It was not elegant. It was ugly, and it was physical, and it cost him more damage than he'd taken in the past week. But when Rimuru arrived to close the Viltrumites, 8 minutes later, the industrial quarter had 163 people still inside. 163 people fewer than 420 was not a good number. It was the number they had. Ciel's voice reached Rimuru in increments, updating the picture as the evacuation progressed. Sector 3 cleared. Sector 7, 60%. Northern approach corridor closing. Viltrumite unit repositioning to block. Redirect flow to Corridor 9. Corridor 9 will hold for 11 minutes. Central City civilian density still critical. Thrag holding position. The Central City was the problem Thrag had designed it to be. He had concentrated his own position there, with the largest civilian population and the most complex distribution of his forces through the residential architecture. It was not a fortress. It was a puzzle built out of people, and the puzzle had been constructed specifically to require more time to solve than it was comfortable to spend solving it. Rimuru moved through the outer zones in layers, bending the geometry of occupied space to create corridors where the architecture didn't offer them, pulling people through before the Viltrumite units could close the gaps, handing them off to GDA. Emergency transports that had been positioned outside the engagement radius. Thrag watched from the Central City's administrative tower. He could see the evacuation happening. He could see the population of Karen being systematically cleared away from his forces, the puzzle he had built, being dismantled piece by piece with a precision and a speed that should not have been possible for any single entity to maintain. He could also see that the process was not instant. It was taking time. And while it was taking time, 38 million people were still on a planet where he held a position. He was patient. He had been patient for 400 years. He gave an order. The Viltrumite units in the Central City began moving not to attack, not to chase the evacuation routes, but deeper into the residential zones, repositioning to increase the geometric complexity of the problem, making the puzzle harder, as Rimuru had predicted. The feed in Rimuru's awareness updated. Central City complexity increasing. Extraction timeline extended by 14 minutes. New civilian pockets identified in sectors 12, 17, and 22. Hostile repositioning pattern consistent with deliberate obstruction. Rimuru was already in Sector 12. The repositioning slowed there, because whatever the Viltrumites in that sector had expected to find when they moved was not what they found. The geometry of the space around them shifted in ways that had nothing to do with architecture. The corridors between buildings briefly becoming longer or shorter than they had been, the angles of approach rearranging themselves in ways that took 3 seconds to register as wrong, and several more seconds to adapt to. 3 seconds. Several more seconds. Mark had 400,000 people moving through corridors in the northern continent, and the flow had not stopped since he arrived. He had been doing this for 31 minutes, and he had not stopped moving once. and the corridors were holding because the Viltrumites, who should have been closing them, had been redirected to the central city, and had not yet realized they'd been moved for that purpose. Nolan was on his fourth site. CL's voice, central city civilian concentration dropping. Thrag's buffer is thinning. Estimated time to full clearance, 22 minutes. Hostile unit count in position decreasing as evacuation routes consume their repositioning options. Thrag received his own estimate at approximately the same time. He stood at the window of the administrative tower and looked at a city that had been 40 minutes ago an unassailable position. It was not unassailable anymore. The population was leaving not in a panicked flood that he could exploit, but in organized flows through routes that appeared and closed with the disciplined rhythm of something being managed from above, by something that understood the geometry of the problem better than anyone he had available to counter it. He had expected Rimuru to be forced to choose, to weigh the lives in the central city against the time it would take to remove them, to accept that some cost was unavoidable, to make the decision that every military force that had encountered this tactic had eventually been forced to make. Rimuru was not making that decision. Rimuru was refusing to have the choice at all. The puzzle Thrag had built out of people was being disassembled with the same systematic patience that had taken his relay network apart, his staging infrastructure, his fleet coherence. The same process applied to a different scale of problem. He had changed the category. The category had not changed anything about the outcome. Mark landed at the edge of the central city's outer ring as the last northern continent transport cleared the atmosphere. His arms were tired in a way that had nothing to do with Viltrumite physiology and everything to do with 37 minutes of moving human beings from places to other places at maximum sustainable speed. He had moved CL's count relayed through Rimuru, 384,000 people. He looked at the city. The flow from the inner zones was still moving. Slower now because the inner zones were harder, but still moving. Above the administrative tower, something in the air was different. Mark watched Rimuru's position resolve from the outward flow moving inward. Now, the outer zones largely clear the geometry of the problem, contracting toward its remaining core. The Viltrumite forces in the city were pulling back toward Thrag's position as their buffer zones emptied around them, and the city was becoming sector by sector. Something that looked less like a hostage situation and more like a battlefield. The battlefield Thrag had been trying to avoid. Below the tower, the last civilian transport lifted. CL's voice in the channel only Rimuru received. Chiron civilian extraction complete. Hostile forces now unshielded. Final count 37,941,212. And below the number, with the clean arithmetic of something that never softened its ledger, 59,407, not reached in time. Rimuru did not stop moving. The last civilian transport cleared Charon's atmosphere at 14:07 local time. Thrag watched it go from the roof of the administrative tower. He had known it was coming, had watched the clearance happen sector by sector, with the unflinching attention of a commander reading a battlefield, cataloging each loss of ground, adjusting his internal accounting of what remained. He was not surprised. He had understood somewhere in the middle of the process that this was not going to work, that the entity on the other side of this calculation was not going to be forced into an impossible choice, that the board he had spent 3 hours building was going to be taken from him the same way everything else had been taken, systematically, without drama, without the kind of collision that gave the losing side something to point to as the moment things changed. The moment things changed had been a relay node at 3:40 a.m. 11 days ago. Everything since had been consequence. He turned from the sky and looked at what remained of his force in the central city. 240 Viltrumites, the survivors of what had once been the outer system's strike capacity, now arranged in the open ground of the administrative district with nothing between them and whatever came next. Some of them were looking at the sky. Some were looking at him. Thrag had led the Empire for longer than any other Grand Regent in its history. He had built its military doctrine, refined its conquest protocols, and overseen the expansion of its reach across more systems than any of his predecessors. He had done all of this on the basis of a single principle, that he had never found a reason to question strength determined the shape of the universe. Everything else, law, ethics, civilization, the elaborate constructions that weaker species built to convince themselves their fragility had value, was contingency, useful when it served strength, irrelevant when it didn't. He had never questioned the principle because the principle had never failed. Until now. He looked at the sky one more time. The transport was gone. The planet was clear. There was nothing left between him and the thing that had taken everything else apart, and the thing had not yet appeared, and the waiting was the worst kind of silence, the kind that understood exactly what it was doing to the people sitting inside it. Then the air above the administrative district changed. Mark was 2 kilometers out when Rimuru came down. Not fast, not the combat descent of the Conquest engagement, not the urgent repositioning of the multi-front response. Slow. The kind of slow that was not caution, but deliberateness, the choice of something that wanted to be seen arriving, because the arrival itself was information. The silver-haired youth descended through the clear air of Karen's afternoon, until both feet touched the ground of the administrative district. And the ground did not crack, and the air did not blast outward, and there was no announcement of any kind except the fact of the presence itself. 240 Viltrumites looked at one person in simple clothing with silver hair and amber eyes. And the 240 of them collectively understood something that none of them had been trained to understand, that the math was finished. Thrag stepped forward. The others fell back. Not ordered to, they read it themselves the same way combat veterans everywhere read the moment when a fight stops being about numbers and becomes about something else. Thrag stopped 10 meters from Rimuru and looked at what was in front of him with the full attention of the most dangerous individual the Viltrum Empire had ever produced. "You've been taking things from me," he said. "Yes. The relays, the staging positions, the fleet, Conquest, Sereth, Karen." He said each one flatly, not accusation inventory. "You've been methodical. I know how your machine works," Rimuru said. "I've been reading it since the first night." Thrag's mustache shifted the micro-expression Mark had come to read as something between acknowledgement and calculation. "Then you know what I'm going to do now. Hit me as hard as you can," Rimuru said, "and hope it's enough." "Yes." He moved. Thrag was faster than Mark expected. Not faster than Rimuru, Mark understood that much by now, but fast in a way that the footage and the briefings and even the Conquest engagement had not fully prepared him for. Thrag did not warm up. He did not test range or probe for defensive tells. He came in at full commitment from the first instant, with the cold brutality of something that had been doing this for 4 centuries and had refined the act of attempting to kill something into the most efficient version of itself. The first pass was devastating. Thrag's opening combination, Mark would count 4 distinct strikes in the space of approximately 1 second, did not land cleanly. Nothing Rimuru did in a fight ever landed cleanly if the opponent telegraphed. But Thrag did not telegraph. He moved like a reflex with 1,000 years of practice behind it. And 2 of the 4 strikes connected, and the impacts, when they connected, were not the contained redirections that most of Rimuru's engagements produced, but full-force Viltrumite hits at maximum commitment. The ground under Rimuru's position cracked. A building 200 meters behind absorbed a shock wave that took out its upper 3 floors. Mark felt the pressure from 2 kilometers away and understood with sudden clarity why Thrag had been the ceiling. Rimuru was still standing. The silver-haired youth took the aftermath of those 2 hits, 4 meters of give a half second of full stop, and came back moving. What Rimuru did in response was not a counterattack in the traditional sense. It was a removal of options. Thrag's forward momentum, his recovery angle, his secondary position, the arc that would have led to a follow-through combination. All of it was addressed in the space between one round and the next, not by superior speed, but by the kind of spatial understanding that made speed secondary. The ground around Thrag changed in the way that geometry changed when Rimuru was working seriously. Not dramatically, precisely. Thrag adjusted. He was too good not to. He read the change and found a line through it, came back in on an angle that should not have been viable, given the altered space, and the second collision was harder than the first. This went on. Mark watched the way you watched something that was both inevitable and extraordinary, unable to look away, unable to fully absorb what was happening, aware that what he was seeing was not going to happen again in anything like the same form for a very long time, if ever. Thrag hit, and hit, and hit. Each time with total commitment, each time with the accumulated refinement of 400 years of nothing else. He bled from 3 places by the 4th pass, and it changed nothing about his speed. He took hits in return that would have removed any other Viltrumite from consciousness, and they did not remove him. He was not invulnerable. He was simply so deep into the logic of this particular kind of being that damage was data, not disruption, information to factor into the next calculation, not a reason to stop calculating. And with each round, Thrag had slightly less room than he'd had before. Not because Rimuru was backing him up, because the space available to him was being addressed. The retreat angles, removed the secondary positions, made unavailable. The recovery arcs shortened until there was 1 less option after every pass, and then 1 fewer than that, and then fewer still. "Retreat vector removed," Cecil said in the frequency only Rimuru heard. Thrag drove forward. He had understood the geometry, had felt it closing around him, and had made the correct tactical read that forward was the only direction that still had options. He hit with everything. He had a sequence that Mark would describe later as the most physically impressive thing he had ever watched a living creature do, a sustained assault that bent the air and cracked the ground and drove the exchange into ranges where spatial repositioning became harder because the distance between them was measured in centimeters. Rimuru did not retreat. The clash at close range lasted 11 seconds. When it was over, Thrag was on one knee. Not felled, not broken. One knee, breathing, still fully conscious, still fully himself. He had sustained what the medical assessment would later describe as damage distributed across every major structural system. Not enough to kill him because Viltrumite physiology did not work that way, but enough to require a full stop. He looked up. Rimuru stood 2 meters away, breathing with the unbroken stillness of something that had completed a calculation and was waiting for the calculation to be acknowledged. "You fight well," Rimuru said. Thrag's expression did not change. "So do you." He did not make it a compliment. He made it an observation which was more honest. "Primary kill route open," Cecil said. Thrag looked at Rimuru for a moment, the look of a man running a final assessment, checking whether the situation had any remaining variables that he had failed to account for. He found none. He had been thorough. He had been correct at every turn. He had deployed every option available to him in the most efficient possible order. And he had reached this moment anyway, and the moment was what it was. "This doesn't change what we are," Thrag said. "No," Rimuru agreed. "It changes what you can do." The distinction sat between them for a second. Then Rimuru moved, and the last Grand Regent of the Viltrum Empire, the strongest Viltrumite ever produced, the architect of its doctrine, the living proof of its highest principle, ceased to be any of those things. It was fast. It was final. It left no ambiguity about what had happened. The 240 Viltrumites in the administrative district did not immediately move. Mark landed on the edge of the cleared ground 40 meters from where Thrag had been and looked at the stillness. 240 beings who had been trained from birth to believe that strength was the organizing principle of the universe, standing in a planet they had used as a weapon, and lost watching the thing that had taken apart their empire stand in the middle of the aftermath and not say anything. Nolan came down beside him. "Is it over?" Mark said. Nolan looked at the Viltrumites, at Rimuru, at the body of the Grand Regent. He was quiet for a long time. The weighted quiet of someone for whom silence was not absence but weight. "For the Empire," he said yes. The afternoon light on Karen was different from Earth, more orange at this latitude, with a quality that made long shadows in the early afternoon. The shadows of the administrative district's surviving buildings stretched across the cleared ground toward the Viltrumites. And the Viltrumites stood in them, and Rimuru stood where the light still reached, and nobody spoke. 240 people who had grown up inside a certainty were standing in the first moment of its absence. And the moment was very large, and nobody knew yet what came after it. Mark thought about his father standing next to him. He thought about a subway car 3 years ago, and a man in a red cape who had believed in the same thing Thrag had believed in. He thought about 40 million people on a planet called Karen, and 59,000 names he would not be able to forget. He did not say any of it out loud. The shadows lengthened. The sky over Karen was wrong in the way skies were wrong after things happened in them. Not dramatic, not red or cracked or split with light. Just wrong in the way of too much smoke at the wrong altitude. Too many objects in low orbit that weren't supposed to be there. Too many signals on too many frequencies trying to reach each other across gaps that yesterday had been filled with working infrastructure. The GDA emergency band was active on 3 continents simultaneously. The Coalition's monitoring buoys were still transmitting the after-action data from the engagement window. Somewhere in the outer system, a GDA automated relay was dutifully recording the absence of every Viltrum node that had been active 48 hours ago. Mark sat on the rubble of a building that had been structurally compromised during the Karen engagement and watched the sky do none of the things it was supposed to do when wars ended. Nobody was cheering. He had expected something, some shift in the air, some collective exhale from the people around him that would indicate the world had processed the last 11 days and arrived at a conclusion. What he got instead was the exact silence of people who had survived something they didn't have language for yet and were waiting for their nervous systems to catch up with the math. The Viltrumites, who had surrendered 231 of them, the ones who had made the calculation that Thrag had not made in time, were being processed by a coalition response team that Alan had organized with the efficient cheerfulness of someone who had been waiting for exactly this kind of problem. Mark had watched Alan work for 6 minutes and had developed a profound respect for the brand of competence that expressed itself through apparent casualness. Nolan was standing 40 meters away at the edge of the cleared ground, looking at the horizon. Mark watched his father stand there for a while. He had watched his father stand like that before the familiar weight of a Viltrumite at rest, when they were not actually resting, when the stillness was thought rather than ease. Nolan had been standing that way since the engagement ended. Not grieving, not relieved. Something older and harder than either. Mark got up and walked over. "How many of them will try to rebuild?" he said. Nolan looked at the surrendered Viltrumites. "Some. Not enough to matter. Not soon." He paused. "The chain of command is gone. The relay infrastructure is gone. The staging positions are gone. The cultural logic that held it together, the certainty that Viltrum always won, that's gone too. A beat that carried 400 years in it. Empires don't survive that combination. You sound sure? I've watched 2 others die, Nolan said. This one took longer. It was better built. He looked at Mark. That doesn't make me proud of it. Mark held that. No, he said. I know. Cecil's channel opened while Mark was crossing back toward the administrative district. I need a conversation, Cecil said. No preamble, no pleasantries. Cecil's version of directness was indistinguishable from efficiency. Rimuru's not answering your calls, Mark said. Rimuru doesn't use channels I control, which is a problem I've decided to stop trying to solve. A pause. The geopolitical situation in the outer systems is going to require management. There are 17 coalition-aligned planets that lost significant population over the last 11 days. There are 231 Viltrumites in custody who are going to need a disposition decision that nobody currently has jurisdiction to make. There is a power vacuum where a 400-year-old empire used to be, and power vacuums get filled, and the things that fill them are not always improvements. I know all of this. I know you know. I'm telling you because I need you to understand that I'm going to start making decisions about it. And I would prefer those decisions to be informed by more than what I currently have. Mark stopped walking. What do you want? I want to know if Rimuru is staying. Mark looked at the administrative district, at the silver-haired figure standing in the cleared ground near the tower. Unhurried talking to no one visible, while Alan's team worked around and past with the practiced ease of people who had learned not to interrupt something they couldn't fully see. Ask them, Mark said. I did. The answer was not encouraging. Rimuru was watching the sky when Mark arrived. Not the smoke or the orbital debris or the monitoring buoys. The part of the sky that was clear, the part that was just sky without the fingerprints of the last 11 days on it. Cecil wants to know if you're staying, Mark said. I know. What did you tell him? That the immediate resurgence probability is low, and the protective layer will hold for approximately 18 months, which is enough time for a functional response architecture to be established if people start building it now. Rimuru paused. He asked what happens after 18 months. What did you say? That it depends on what people do in the first 18 months. Mark stood beside the silver-haired youth and looked at the same piece of clear sky. He won't like that answer. No. Something that was not quite a smile, but occupied adjacent territory. He won't. Mark was quiet for a moment. Then, are you going back wherever you came from? There are things that need doing there too. Rimuru turned to look at him, the amber gaze direct, carrying none of the strategic assessment that had characterized every look in the first week, just a straightforward attention. This isn't my world to stay in. It never was. You saved it? Yes. The word was simple, not modest, not proud. A fact that had been true and was now complete. That doesn't mean I get to own it. Mark thought about his father's words at the edge of the cleared ground, about Cecil's 17 planets and 231 detainees, about the vacuum that needed filling, about 59,000 names on Karen, and 11 on Earth about the pharmacy owner in Sao Paulo, who had maintained the same even tone since the first responders arrived and was probably still doing it. I don't know how to do this, he said. The part after, I don't know how to build what needs to be built, when the whole world just watched something like you walk through it. Rimuru considered that for a moment. You've been watching a world get saved by someone else's power, Rimuru said. That's not what the next part looks like. The next part is harder and slower, and it won't be impressive to watch. The amber gaze moved back to the sky. But it's yours, And the fact that it's hard is not a reason to wait for someone stronger to come along and make it easier. Mark turned that over. Is that supposed to be encouraging? He said. It's supposed to be true. Mark exhaled. It came out longer than he expected. Okay, he said. Yeah. Ciel's voice in the register, only Rimuru, heard primary war capability neutralized. Resurgence probability within acceptable range. Departure window clear. Rimuru looked at the sky one more time, at the clear part. Take care of them, Rimuru said. It was not addressed to Mark alone. It was addressed to the world, or to the sky, or to no one at all. The kind of statement that does not require a recipient, because the obligation it names already exists, whether or not anyone is listening. Then the silver-haired youth took one step forward and was no longer there. No seam, no light, no sound. The sky did not crack. The air did not change. There was no mechanism to observe no departure, to describe no event that the GDA's instruments would register as anything other than an absence where a presence had been. Mark stood in the cleared ground of Karen's administrative district with the sky overhead and the work ahead, and the weight of a world that had just been handed back to the people who lived in it. And he stood there for a while, and the sky was clear where it was clear, and damaged where it was damaged. And that was the condition in which the future would have to begin. Alan landed beside him with significantly more noise than the departure had made. So, Alan said, what now? Mark looked at the sky, at the smoke and the orbital debris and the monitoring buoys and the clear part beyond all of it. Now we figure it out, he said.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, and be sure to turn on notifications so you won't miss our future videos. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next time.